At my father's black tie birthday gala, my brother slapped me across the face and shouted, "You do not belong here." Everyone looked at me as if I were nothing. Then the governor stood up, looked around the room, and said, "You people really do not know who she is." Silence swallowed the entire ballroom. The sharp crack of my brother's hand against my face silenced the entire room. Hundreds of the city's most elite guests froze, their eyes fixed on my shattered champagne flute, its contents spilling across the marble floor. "You do not belong here," he yelled, his face contorted with disgust. My mother stood beside him. Her diamond necklace sparkled as she mocked my past failures, asking loudly if I had come to beg for money. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I simply stood there waiting for the perfect moment to destroy them. What they did not know was that the most powerful man in the room was about to end their entire world with a single sentence. "I am Cassidy Sterling. I am 33 years old, and until that night, my family believed I was the ultimate failure." Before continuing this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to prove your worth to people who desperately wanted to see you fail. The air in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York City was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted duck, and pure arrogance. It was the 62nd birthday gala for my father, Richard Sterling, a lavish event meticulously designed to showcase our family's supposed wealth and flawless social status. I had not spoken to my family in over a decade, having walked away from their toxic expectations a long time ago. But that night I walked through those double doors in a custom midnight blue gown, holding a vintage champagne flute, completely indifferent to the whispers spreading through the crowd. My brother Preston, now 36, and the supposedly brilliant chief executive officer of the family logistics firm, spotted me almost immediately. He crossed the room, leaving his wealthy conversation partners behind. His face was flushed with a mix of panic and absolute rage. Before I could say a single word of greeting, his hand swung with brutal force. The slap echoed through the spacious hall with a sickening crack. My head snapped to the side, and the crystal flute slipped from my fingers, shattering against the polished marble floor. The expensive champagne splashed over my designer heels. "You do not belong here," Preston shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted gold leaf ceilings. "Who let you in?" The string quartet playing in the corner stopped abruptly. Dozens of wealthy Wall Street investors, politicians, and socialites turned their heads. Their whispered conversations died instantly. The silence was heavy and suffocating. My mother, Beatrice, appeared beside Preston, her face a perfectly manicured mask of outrage. She was 60 but spent a fortune trying to look 40. She smoothed her silk dress and looked me up and down with utter contempt, making sure her voice carried loud enough for the surrounding VIP guests to hear. "Security is on the way," Beatrice announced, waving a perfectly manicured hand dismissively. "I cannot believe you have the audacity to show your face here, Cassidy. You dropped out of college at 20 because you were supposedly too depressed to handle basic responsibilities. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family and always have been." I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch. I did not rub my burning cheek. I did not break eye contact. I simply stared at them, observing their desperate, pathetic need to control the narrative. "What do you want?" Beatrice scoffed, stepping closer, her voice dripping with venom. "Are you here to beg for cash? Because your father and I are not going to fund the pathetic, miserable existence you have been living since you ran away. You are a college dropout. You are nothing." Preston puffed out his chest, glancing at the guests to gauge their reactions. He wanted them to see him as the strong, successful son protecting his parents from the unhinged failure of a daughter. "Get out of here before I have you taken out in handcuffs," he threatened, pointing toward the heavy mahogany doors. In the past, this kind of public humiliation would have completely broken me. When I was younger, I would have run out the door sobbing, convinced I truly was the worthless girl they painted me to be. But at 33, I was no longer their victim. I had spent the last decade building an empire from absolutely nothing. I was the founder and CEO of Aegis Data Defense, one of the most ruthless and secretive cybersecurity and data intelligence firms on the East Coast. My servers held the darkest secrets, financial portfolios, and security protocols of half the billionaires standing in this very room. I did not need to defend myself. I simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made my mother physically recoil in confusion. Before she could open her mouth to respond, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the heavy tension of the ballroom. The crowd parted instantly as Governor Mitchell stepped forward. He was the guest of honor for the evening, the absolute crown jewel of my father's extensive and desperate networking efforts. My parents had spent the entire night trying to get just 5 minutes of his time. My father, Richard, finally rushed over from the bar, desperate to do damage control in front of the highest official in the state. Governor, I am so deeply sorry. This is just a minor family misunderstanding. My estranged daughter is clearly unwell and causing a disturbance. We are handling it immediately. Governor Mitchell did not look at my father, he did not look at Preston, nor at my mother. He looked directly at me. A smile of knowing and supreme respect spread across his weathered face. He laughed, a deep, rich sound that completely confused my family and sent a ripple of unease through my father's posture. The governor slowly turned his gaze back to my father, his expression shifting from amusement to absolute disbelief. He pointed his glass at me. You people really do not know who she is. The silence that swallowed the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Preston went completely pale. His arrogant posture dissolved into sudden uncertainty. My mother's mouth fell open, her eyes darting between the governor and me. What do you mean? My father stammered, his voice suddenly stripped of all its previous authority, as he looked from the governor to the daughter he had spent years pretending did not exist. Governor Mitchell shook his head slowly, his eyes locked on my father with a mix of pity and sheer disdain. Richard, the governor said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. The woman you are threatening to have removed in handcuffs is the founder and CEO of Aegis Data Defense. My father blinked rapidly. The name of the firm clearly was not registering in his panicking mind. Let me make it clear to you, the governor continued, stepping closer to me with a respectful nod. Last month, a highly coordinated syndicate attempted to breach the state pension fund. They were minutes away from draining $500 million from the accounts of hardworking citizens. Your daughter and her elite team of analysts detected the breach, locked down our entire financial network, and tracked the hackers back to their source before federal authorities even knew what was happening. She saved this state from a catastrophic financial collapse. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The wealthy socialites and ruthless Wall Street investors who moments before were judging my outfit were now looking at me with open admiration. Governor Mitchell swept his arm across the room toward the surrounding crowd. Look around this room, Richard. Half the billionaires drinking your champagne tonight are her private clients. She secures their corporate infrastructure. She protects their offshore assets. They trust her with their most closely guarded secrets. And you just called her a worthless dropout. The color drained from Preston's face so fast he looked physically ill. He took a faltering step backward, his hand dropping limply to his side. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face his entire life melted into a mask of pure terror. He suddenly realized he had just assaulted a woman who held enough power and data to ruin every single person in this room. My mother, Beatrice, looked like she was choking. Her eyes darted frantically around the ballroom. The whispers had completely changed. The elite guests were no longer mocking the uninvited daughter. They were mocking the foolish, ignorant parents who had just humiliated the most powerful woman at the gala. I could hear the harsh judgments floating from the crowd. Can you believe they treated her like that? A prominent real estate mogul whispered to his wife. They disowned a tech prodigy. A banking executive muttered with a harsh laugh. Idiots. Beatrice, terrified of losing her precious social status, immediately tried to change tactics. The sudden shift in her demeanor was nauseating. Her face flushed, and she forced a trembling, desperate smile as she reached her hands out toward me. Cassidy, my mother gasped, her voice shaking with manufactured affection. Oh, darling, we had no idea. We thought you were struggling. You know how protective your brother is. We were just worried about you. We are incredibly proud of the woman you have become. She reached out to grab my arm, trying to pull me into a maternal embrace for the watching crowd. I did not move, but my icy glare made her freeze inches away from me. She recoiled as if she had touched a live wire. Do not touch me, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but with enough authority to make her flinch. My father finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a conciliatory gesture. He looked at the governor, then at the wealthy guests, desperately trying to salvage the remains of his reputation. Cassidy, please, Richard babbled, sweating profusely in his tailored tuxedo. Let us go to a private room. We can talk about this. You are our daughter. We are family. This is just a massive misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Richard, I replied, addressing him by his first name. You made your stance perfectly clear over a decade ago when you threw me out on the street with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. You made it clear when you told me I was a worthless burden. You made it clear tonight when your son struck me in the face while you stood by and did nothing. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off with a single, sharp look. He snapped his mouth shut, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. I turned away from my trembling family and signaled to the catering manager, who was frozen near the kitchen doors. He rushed over immediately, terrified. "Bring me tonight's bill," I ordered. The manager looked at my father, then back at me, before pulling a leather folder from his jacket. "The total is $120,000, ma'am." My father stepped forward, his pride wounded. "Cassidy, put that away. I am paying for my own birthday. I do not need your charity. You do not have a choice," I said coldly. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a solid titanium black card, the kind of card that required an 8-figure bank balance just to receive an invitation. I handed it to the manager, who took it with shaking fingers and immediately processed the transaction on his mobile terminal. It was approved instantly. I turned back to the 3 people who shared my blood but had never been my family. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was witnessing the final execution of Richard and Beatrice's social status. I looked my father dead in the eye, then shifted my gaze to my mother, and finally to my brother, who was still rubbing the hand he had used to slap me. "Consider my childhood debt paid in full," I said, my voice ringing clearly across the grand ballroom. "Do not ever claim me as your family again." I did not wait for their response. I did not look back to see my mother collapse into a chair weeping genuine tears of social ruin. I did not look back to see the governor shaking his head in disgust at my father. I simply turned and walked out of the ballroom. The crowd of billionaires and politicians parted for me immediately, stepping aside with absolute respect. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, cutting the tie to my past forever. But my sudden reappearance had rattled my family more than I knew, and the fallout of their financial desperation was about to come hunting for me. The crisp morning air of the city did nothing to wash away the lingering adrenaline from the gala. By 7 o'clock, I was parking my car in the underground executive garage at Aegis Data Defense. The secure facility was a fortress of reinforced concrete and bright LED lighting, accessible only to top-tier personnel. I parked in my reserved spot, killed the engine, and gathered my briefcase, my mind already shifting to the global security briefings waiting on my desk. Before I could even lock my car, the sharp, echoing click of designer heels against the concrete broke the silence. I turned to see Nia stepping out from behind a concrete pillar. She was 34, a wildly successful luxury real estate broker, and the woman my brother Preston had married 5 years ago. Nia was a striking woman who knew exactly how to command a room, dressed impeccably that morning in a tailored blazer and holding a designer handbag that cost more than most people make in a year. She had obviously bypassed the outer security gate by tailgating an employee's vehicle, a bold move that proved exactly how desperate she was. "Cassidy, please do not call security," Nia said, raising her free hand in a conciliatory gesture as she walked toward me. Her voice was smooth, polished, and dripping with a manufactured warmth that immediately put me on high alert. "I just want to talk, woman to woman." I did not reach for my panic button, but I did not step away from my car either. "You are trespassing on a federal contractor's facility, Nia. I suggest you make it quick before armed guards escort you out." Nia sighed, stopping a few feet away. She composed her features into a mask of deep, sisterly concern. "Last night was a disaster. Preston is completely beside himself with guilt over what happened. You have to understand, he is under an overwhelming amount of pressure right now. He did not mean to hurt you." "He struck me in the face in front of the governor of this state," I replied, my voice stripped of any emotion. "That is not pressure, Nia. That is a complete lack of impulse control and basic human decency." Nia took another step forward, her tone shifting into the classic manipulative cadence she used to close million-dollar real estate deals. "You know how men are with their pride, Cassidy. He is terrified. The family logistics firm is facing a severe liquidity issue. Supply chain disruptions and some aggressive expansion tactics have left them completely strapped for cash. He is carrying the weight of your father's entire empire on his shoulders." I stared at her, absorbing the audacity of her words. "So he slapped me because he is bad at his job." "Do not be difficult, Cassidy," she snapped, her carefully constructed patience cracking for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it over. "You made your point last night. You humiliated your parents. You proved you are wildly successful. You won. But family is still family. You have hundreds of millions of dollars at your disposal. Be the bigger person here. Write your brother a check to cover the operating costs and save the family legacy. It is pocket change for you. I glanced down at the handbag resting on her forearm. The cognitive dissonance was truly staggering. You are standing in my parking garage holding a $40,000 crocodile skin handbag, I said, my gaze snapping back up to meet hers. You are wearing a Cartier watch, and you drive a luxury SUV that is probably parked illegally upstairs. Yet you are begging a woman your husband just assaulted to bail out his failing company. Do you not see the absolute absurdity of this request? Nia lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. I earned this bag by closing commercial real estate deals. My money is separate. This is about the family business. If it goes under, your father will not survive the shame. Preston will lose his mind. We are talking about generations of work going into bankruptcy over a temporary cash flow problem. You have the power to fix this with one phone call. I do not reward violence with venture capital, I said, my tone absolute and final. And I certainly do not fund businesses run by incompetent executives. Tell Preston to liquidate his own assets. Tell him to sell his cars. Tell him to take out a second mortgage on that Greenwich mansion you two live in. But do not ever approach me for money again. Nia glared at me. The friendly facade was completely gone. The raw, desperate sense of entitlement radiated off her. You are incredibly selfish, Cassidy. You always were. You finally get some money and power, and you use it to crush your own blood. I have no blood here, I replied. Now get off my property. I turned my back to her and walked toward the private elevator. I could hear her muttering curses under her breath as she finally turned and headed toward the exit. I swiped my access card and stepped into the glass elevator, watching the steel doors slide shut, locking her out completely. As the elevator began its rapid ascent to the top floor, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly faded, leaving behind the cold, calculating instincts of a data intelligence analyst. I looked at myself in the reflection of the polished glass doors. Something was deeply wrong. My father's logistics company had held lucrative ironclad state and federal shipping contracts for over 3 decades. They owned their entire fleet of transport vehicles outright. The overhead was predictable, and the profit margins were notoriously wide. A generational empire like that does not suddenly face a catastrophic, business-ending liquidity crisis just from minor supply chain disruptions. Furthermore, Preston was arrogant, but he was also deeply risk-averse. He liked safe, guaranteed money. He liked looking successful without putting in the actual work. For the company to be hemorrhaging money so severely that his wife was ambushing estranged relatives in parking garages, millions had to be missing. Where did the money go? A temporary cash flow problem was the lie Nia was selling. But the data did not add up. The desperate violence at the gala, the sudden need for massive, immediate injections of off-the-books cash, Nia aggressively protecting her own wealth while begging for my corporate funds. It was not a struggling business. It was a hemorrhage. The elevator dinged, arriving at the executive floor. I stepped out, my mind racing with possibilities. Embezzlement, bad investments, illegal gambling, whatever it was massive, and Preston was terrified of it coming to light. I walked right past my assistant, ignoring the morning briefing folders waiting on my desk. I needed to look at the numbers myself. I needed to pull the financial threads of my father's pristine empire and see exactly what kind of rot was hiding underneath. Before I could even launch my secure terminal and begin the digital excavation, my personal cell phone vibrated sharply against the mahogany wood of my desk. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, though the arrogant, commanding tone gave the sender away instantly. It was my mother. The message stated that she and my father had secured a private table at Jean-Georges for 1 o'clock. She claimed they expected to see me there because it was time we put this silly feud behind us. I should have blocked the number immediately. I had critical work to do. I had a corporate autopsy to perform on their logistics company to figure out exactly why my sister-in-law was begging for money in a parking garage. But the timing was too perfect to ignore. Nia ambushes me at dawn, and my parents summon me at noon. They were coordinated. They were desperate. I decided to accept the invitation, not to make peace, but to look my enemies in the eye and listen to exactly what kind of lies they were trying to sell. Jean-Georges was an ultra-exclusive dining club in Manhattan, the kind of place where politicians and hedge fund managers made handshake deals over $100 plates of seared scallops. I arrived at exactly 1 o'clock, wearing a charcoal gray tailored suit that projected absolute authority. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded leather booth in the back of the dining room where Richard and Beatrice were already seated. They looked entirely too comfortable. My father wore a bespoke navy suit, casually swirling a glass of expensive Bordeaux. My mother was draped in cashmere, her neck adorned with heavy pearls. If they were facing financial ruin, they were doing an exceptional job dressing like the unbothered elite. As I approached the table, my mother beamed, offering a sickly sweet smile that turned my stomach. "Cassidy, darling," Beatrice cooed, gesturing for me to sit across from them. "You look absolutely stunning. We are so thrilled you decided to join us today." I slid into the leather booth, keeping my posture rigid and my expression blank. I did not return the smile. A waiter appeared instantly, but I simply ordered a black coffee and declined the menu. Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands together over the pristine white tablecloth. He gave me a look of manufactured paternal pride that felt like a physical insult. "We have been reading about Aegis data defense all morning," he said, his voice smooth and heavily practiced. "I must say, we are incredibly impressed. We always knew you had a sharp mind for technology. You certainly proved everyone wrong last night." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his words hang in the heavy air of the restaurant. He was casually sweeping a decade of abandonment under the rug. He was completely erasing the fact that less than 12 hours prior, his son had struck me in the face while he stood by, and did absolutely nothing. They operated under the delusion that my success washed away their sins, that my wealth somehow bought them a clean slate. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Richard," I said, my voice cold and flat. "Nia ambushed me in my parking garage at 7 this morning. Whatever fabricated apology you have prepared, you can save your breath. Tell me exactly what you want." Beatrice gasped softly, bringing a hand to her chest in feigned shock. "Cassidy, please." Nia acted on her own. "She is just very emotional right now. We are here as a family. We want to build bridges." "Build bridges," I repeated, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "Or build a bridge straight to my bank account?" Richard cleared his throat, his composed facade cracking just a fraction. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "The truth is, Cassidy, the logistics firm is on the verge of a massive expansion. We have a rare opportunity to acquire a rival fleet that would double our market share on the East Coast. It is a very lucrative project, but it requires fast, liquid capital. Traditional banks move too slowly for an acquisition of this magnitude." I watched him weave the lie flawlessly. There was no expansion. Nia had already let it slip that they were covering operating costs, not buying out competitors. They were drowning and trying to paint the sinking ship as a luxury cruise liner. "We want to offer you the chance to come on board as an angel investor," Richard continued, his eyes gleaming with desperate greed. "It would be highly profitable for you, of course, but more importantly, it would send a message. It would be a unified front. It would show the board, the governor, and the whole city that you have forgiven your brother for his little outburst last night. It is just family helping family." I sat in absolute silence, letting the sheer magnitude of their hypocrisy wash over me. A little outburst. That was what they called a physical assault, an investment opportunity. That was what they called a bailout for a failing, mismanaged company. The waiter arrived, placing my black coffee on the table. He also set 2 meticulously arranged plates of lobster risotto in front of my parents. The smell of rich butter and truffle oil filled the air. I did not touch my cup. "You want me to hand millions of dollars over to Preston?" I said, leaning slightly forward, locking eyes with my father. "To prove my loyalty to a family that erased my existence?" Beatrice leaned in, her voice taking on a sharp, scolding tone that I remembered all too well from my childhood. "You are being terribly stubborn, Cassidy. Preston is your flesh and blood. He made a mistake yesterday. Yes, but he carries the weight of the family legacy. You have more money than you could ever spend. It is your duty to help him." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but ice in my veins. "Duty," I repeated softly. "That is a fascinating word, Beatrice. Let us talk about duty. Let us talk about what happened when I was 21. My parents went rigid. The arrogant smiles finally vanished completely from their faces. "I was working 3 different shifts just to pay rent on a roach-infested studio apartment because you cut me off without a dime," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp register. "I collapsed from severe malnutrition and exhaustion. I woke up in a cold hospital bed with an IV in my arm. The doctors called you because you were still listed as my emergency contact. Do you remember what you told the triage nurse? Neither of them spoke. The color began to drain from Richard's face. You told her to discharge me to a homeless shelter, I continued, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. You told the hospital social worker that my collapse was a lesson in independence, and that bailing me out would only coddle my weakness. You left your daughter facing a mountain of medical debt alone while you flew to Aspen for a golf tournament. Beatrice swallowed hard, looking down at her lap. Times were different then, she whispered defensively. We had to be tough on you to make you strong. And I learned the lesson perfectly, I replied, picking up my designer clutch and sliding out of the leather booth. I learned how to build an empire without you. I learned how to become untouchable. Now Preston is 36 years old. He is a grown man playing the role of a CEO. If his company is expanding, let him raise his own capital. If he is drowning, let him sink. Let him learn his own lesson in independence. Cassidy, wait, Richard demanded, his voice rising in panic as he half stood from the table. You cannot just walk away. We are talking about the family business. We are talking about total ruin. I paused, looking down at the two miserable people sitting behind their untouched plates of lobster risotto. I pulled out a $50 bill and dropped it onto the pristine white tablecloth. That is for the coffee I did not drink, I said smoothly. The rest of the expensive bill is yours. I suggest you enjoy the meal, Richard. From what I hear about your liquidity issues, you might not be dining at Jean-Georges for much longer. I turned my back on their horrified faces and walked out of the restaurant, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. The lunch had given me exactly what I needed. Their desperation was palpable. The lie about the expansion fleet confirmed they were trying to cover a massive financial crater. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lead analyst as I stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. The personal confrontations were over. It was time to tear apart their corporate facade. Dominic answered on the first ring. I gave him a single, clear directive before climbing into the back of my waiting car. I told him to prep the secure room and isolate the network. We were going hunting. The drive back to Aegis Data Defense headquarters took less than 20 minutes, but my mind processed 1,000 different variables along the way. My parents thought they could manipulate me with a free lunch and a fabricated story about business expansion. They were operating with outdated tactics, bringing a butter knife to a digital warfare operation. By the time my driver passed through the heavily fortified security gates of my building, I had already mapped out the legal boundaries we were about to push. I stepped off the elevator on the executive floor and walked past the glass-walled conference rooms. At the end of the hall stood the SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. It was a room completely encased in radio frequency shielding, immune to electronic eavesdropping, cellular signals, or unauthorized network access. I placed my hand on the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door hissed open on its hydraulics. Dominic was already inside. He was 30 years old, fiercely intelligent, and possessed an innate ability to see patterns in data that most machines missed. He was seated, surrounded by 6 curved monitors, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. When I walked in, he did not look away from the scrolling lines of code. I isolated the server and routed our connection through a dozen encrypted proxies, Dominic said, completely calm. The digital footprint will look like background noise. What exactly are we looking for, boss? Everything, I replied, pulling a chair up to his workstation. I want the complete financial anatomy of Vanguard Logistics. I want their tax returns, their payroll ledgers, their vendor contracts, and their debt obligations. Strip the company down to the studs. Dominic nodded, typing a final command. The screens flickered, splitting into designated sectors. At first, we pulled the surface data public records, quarterly reports filed for state compliance, basic operating expenses. On paper, Richard and Preston had constructed a masterclass in creative accounting. To a standard auditor, the logistics firm looked like a stagnant but stable enterprise. Profit margins were razor-thin, supposedly due to rising fuel costs and supply chain bottlenecks. But I did not build a multi-billion-dollar intelligence firm by looking at the surface. I leaned closer to the center monitor, tracing the operating expense lines. Look at the fleet maintenance logs, I instructed, pointing to a column of figures. Vanguard Logistics owns its trucks outright. They have an in-house mechanic crew. Why are their external maintenance costs spiking 40% over the last 3 quarters? Dominic isolated the dataset. He ran a cross-referencing algorithm, pulling the names of the third-party maintenance vendors. He scoffed. He highlighted 5 specific companies that had been receiving massive, recurring wire transfers from my father's corporate accounts. These are shell companies, Dominic stated flatly. all of them registered in the last 2 years. 3 in Delaware, 2 in Nevada. No public-facing executives, no physical addresses other than registered agent P.O. boxes. Vanguard is paying ghosts. Preston was getting sloppy. I told Dominic to bypass the standard vendor firewalls and follow the money. I wanted to know exactly where those phantom maintenance fees were landing. Dominic initiated a deep dive, deploying proprietary tracking software that Aegis Data Defense usually reserved for hunting international criminal syndicates. We watched the money move in real time across the glowing monitors. Preston had set up an automated system to siphon funds directly out of the logistics firm's operating capital. The cash flowed into the Delaware Shell Company. It was washed through a series of anonymous holding accounts, and then it vanished offshore. Cyprus, Dominic muttered, his eyes narrowing as the tracking software hit a wall of international banking privacy protocols. Then Malta, then the Cayman Islands. He is moving the cash through jurisdictions that do not cooperate with U.S. financial regulators. This is not a business expansion, Cassidy. This is capital flight. Keep digging, I ordered, the cold reality of my family's corruption crystallizing in my mind. Cross-reference the offshore transfer dates with Preston's personal travel logs and calendar events. Dominic pulled up Preston's digital footprint. My brother had never been careful with his data security. He lived his life for social media validation and digital convenience. Dominic synced the massive outbound wire transfers from the shell companies with Preston's personal movements. The pattern was undeniable. Every single time a massive chunk of cash disappeared into an offshore account, Preston had a scheduled meeting with a specific private equity group, but they were not legitimate investors. Dominic pulled the registration details of the firm Preston was meeting with. It was a front for an unregulated, high-stakes offshore gambling syndicate. The entire picture materialized on the screens before us. The logistics company was not just failing, it was bleeding out at a violent terminal velocity. My father had likely handed the financial reins over to Preston, believing his golden boy could modernize the firm. Instead, Preston had treated a generational empire like his personal casino fund. Dominic brought up the company's current liquidity ratio. Boss, you need to see this. I looked at the final dashboard. The numbers were entirely red. Vanguard Logistics had burned through its entire cash reserve. To keep the lights on and the trucks moving, Preston had started leveraging the company's hard assets. He had quietly mortgaged the warehouses. He had taken out predatory mezzanine debt using the company fleet as collateral. The millions of dollars pouring out of the company were not going toward growth, employee benefits, or operational stability. The money was bleeding out to cover catastrophic, staggering gambling losses. They are dead in the water, Dominic said quietly, leaning back in his chair. The company cannot make payroll in another 2 months. Creditors are going to seize everything. I stared at the glowing red numbers, feeling a dark, profound sense of vindication. Nia had begged me for cash in the parking garage. My parents had tried to manipulate me into an investment over luxury meals. They were all desperately trying to plug a massive hole in a sinking ship, hoping my wealth could save them from the brutal consequences of their own arrogance. Print the offshore transfer logs, I ordered, my voice stripped of any sympathy. Compile the shell company registrations and the debt collateral agreements. Put it all in a hard copy file. Dominic nodded, already initiating the secure printing protocols. We got him, he said. We only have the first piece, I replied, staring at the financial wreckage of my father's legacy. Now I want to see exactly how desperate my brother is. Search the hidden ledgers for my name. I want to know if he tried to drag me into this grave with him. Dominic's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with a renewed sense of urgency. The ambient hum of the server rack seemed to amplify in the heavy silence of the room. He ran my personal identification matrix through the dark web financial registries, scanning unregulated lending platforms and private equity back channels. For several long minutes, the monitors flickered with lines of encrypted data. I stood behind him with my arms crossed, watching as the automated algorithms scoured thousands of digital records. The $8 million Preston had already embezzled and laundered through the Cayman Islands proved he was a criminal. But stealing from our father was one thing. I needed to know if his desperation had crossed the line to attack me directly. A sharp warning tone suddenly chimed from the center console. Dominic froze. A red alert dialog box expanded across the primary monitor. Boss, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave. The tracking software just tripped a massive wire in a shadow banking network based in Chicago. Pull it up, I commanded, leaning closer to the screen. Dominic bypassed the final security gate and opened a scanned digital packet. It was a commercial loan agreement. The lender was a notorious mezzanine debt firm, known for predatory interest rates and ruthless collection tactics. They operated in the gray area of corporate finance, lending exorbitant amounts of money to desperate businesses that traditional banks had already blacklisted. The principal loan amount was $3 million. The interest rate was a staggering 22% compounding monthly. The borrower was listed as Vanguard Logistics. Scroll down to the guarantor section, I ordered, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. Dominic scrolled to the final page of the document. The digital signatures glowed brightly against the stark white background. The primary signatory was Preston, but right below his name, occupying the line reserved for the personal guarantor, was my name. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Next to my printed name was a flawless replica of my signature, along with my social security number and my old permanent address. "He forged it," Dominic whispered in absolute disbelief. "He used your identity to secure the loan." I leaned in closer, analyzing the strokes of the digital signature. It was not a recent forgery. It was an exact copy of the signature I used when I was 20 years old, right around the time my parents threw me out of the house. Preston had dug up my old college financial aid applications or medical release forms. He had held on to my sensitive data for over a decade, waiting for the exact moment he needed a clean credit profile to leverage his own survival. "Run a status check on that loan," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Dominic typed furiously. The data refreshed. The loan was finalized 8 months ago. Preston had used the $3 million to cover his initial offshore gambling debts, hoping a winning streak would allow him to pay it back before anyone noticed. But the house always wins. Preston lost every last dime. "The loan is currently in default," Dominic reported, bringing up the collection timeline. "They have issued 2 internal warnings to Vanguard Logistics. The grace period expired yesterday. Per the contract's stipulations, the lender is now legally authorized to seize the assets of the personal guarantor, which means they are coming for me," I stated flatly. Dominic nodded, spinning his chair to face me. "Cassidy, this is a highly aggressive debt collection firm. They do not care about family drama or claims of forgery on paper. You are legally on the hook for $3 million plus astronomical interest. They will freeze your personal accounts. They might try to place a lien on Aegis Data Defense. Preston did not just steal from your father. He tied a financial anvil around your neck and threw you off a cliff." The sheer scale of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. For one brief, agonizing second, I felt the familiar sting of the 20-year-old girl who had been abandoned by her family. My own brother had weaponized my identity to fund his criminal lifestyle. He had smirked at me at that gala, slapped me across the face, and demanded I leave, knowing full well he had legally bound me to his catastrophic debt. My parents had begged me to invest in their expansion over lobster risotto, fully aware that their golden boy had already committed federal identity theft to stay afloat. They thought I was just a wealthy, estranged daughter they could manipulate. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who held the digital keys to the city. The momentary pain evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, absolute fury. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. The victim narrative died the second I looked back at the screen. Dominic watched me carefully. "Do you want me to call Gideon? We can file an emergency injunction and report the identity theft to the police immediately. We can have Preston arrested tonight." "No," I said, my eyes locked on the forged signature. Calling the cops was standard protocol. It was the safe, predictable move. But throwing Preston into a holding cell would not fix the systemic rot of my family. It would not balance the scales. If I simply reported the fraud, my parents would spin the narrative. They would claim Preston made a desperate mistake to save the family business. They would paint me as the vengeful sister who destroyed her brother over money. They would keep their social status and play the victims. I refused to give them that satisfaction. "Dominic," I said, stepping back from the monitors and straightening my posture, "I want you to track down every single creditor currently holding debt against Vanguard Logistics. I want the names of the banking executives, the private equity managers, and the shadow lenders." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "All of them," I confirmed. Preston tried to leverage my assets to save his skin. Now I am going to buy his entire existence. We are going to buy that $3 million predatory loan from that shadow firm. Then we are going to buy the warehouse mortgages and the truck fleet liens. Dominic looked at me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he realized exactly what I was planning. "You are going to become his primary creditor." "I am going to become his only creditor," I corrected. They wanted my money. They are going to get it. I am going to buy Vanguard Logistics out from under them, piece by agonizing piece. And when the time is right, I am not just going to foreclose on his company. I am going to take everything they own. I turned toward the heavy steel door of the secure facility. The plan was already executing flawlessly in my mind. Establish a secure line with Gideon, I ordered without looking back. Tell him to prep the acquisition contracts. We are going corporate hunting. The ambush in the parking garage and the hypocritical lunch had been their final, desperate moves for survival. They thought they were playing a game of family manipulation, but the game was already over, and the slaughter was about to begin. Gideon arrived at my penthouse exactly 45 minutes later. He was a ruthless Wall Street litigator who navigated corporate bloodbaths with the precision of a surgeon. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer useless sympathies about family betrayal. He walked through my front door, dropped his leather briefcase onto the glass dining table, and pulled out a gold fountain pen. I slid the printed dossier Dominic had compiled across the table. Gideon reviewed the offshore transfer logs, the shell company registries, and finally, the forged $3 million loan agreement. His eyes tracked the fake signature. A sharp, predatory grin appeared on his face. He committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, Gideon stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum of anticipation, and he tied it directly to Vanguard Logistics' primary operating accounts. We have him dead to rights, Cassidy. I can have U.S. Marshals pulling him out of his bed by dawn. No marshals, I replied, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. I told you on the phone. We are not just throwing him in a cell. We are taking the company. I need to paralyze him first. I want him to know I hold the detonator, and I want him to spend the next 48 hours suffocating in his own panic. Gideon leaned back, tapping his gold pen against the glass table. Then we hit him with a legal shock and awe campaign. A formal cease and desist regarding the fraudulent use of your identity, paired with an immediate demand for a forensic corporate audit. Since your social security number is now legally bound to his corporate debt, you have the legal right to demand a full review of his ledgers. We will bury him in legal threats so severe he will not be able to breathe. Draft it, I ordered. Make it heavy. Make it terrifying. We spent the next 2 hours building a legal binder, designed to act as a psychological weapon. It contained copies of the forged signature, references to the exact federal statutes Preston had violated, and a notice that an independent forensic accounting firm had been retained to audit Vanguard Logistics. We demanded immediate access to all servers, offshore transaction logs, and internal communications. We set a 48-hour deadline for full compliance. Failure to comply would result in immediate criminal prosecution and the freezing of all corporate assets. We did not call him. We did not send an angry email. We dispatched a process server in a sharp black suit directly to Vanguard Logistics headquarters. Across the city, Preston was sitting in his spacious corner office, desperately trying to ignore the ringing phones. The logistics firm was in a state of quiet chaos. Unpaid vendors were threatening to halt shipments, and the accounting department was demanding answers about the missing cash reserves. Preston was sweating through his tailored shirt, staring at his computer screen, trying to figure out how to pull another loan from a shadow bank. The heavy glass door to his office swung open. His secretary stood there, terrified, followed closely by the process server. The man in the black suit did not ask for permission. He walked straight up to Preston's massive oak desk and dropped a thick, leather-bound legal binder right on top of his keyboard. The heavy thud echoed in the room. "Preston Sterling, you have been served," the man stated flatly, before turning and walking out. Preston stared at the binder. The gold-embossed logo of Gideon's notorious Wall Street law firm gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His hand started shaking as he reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was the cease and desist order. The second page was the high-definition scan of the forged $3 million loan document. The third page outlined the federal minimum sentencing guidelines for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Preston felt the blood drain completely from his face. His stomach churned violently. He gripped the edge of his desk, his vision tunneled. He had assumed I was still the fragile, depressed 20-year-old girl they had easily discarded. He thought he could steal my identity, use it to cover his gambling debts, and I would be too ignorant or too scared to figure it out. He flipped to the next section. It was the demand for a forensic audit signed by my legal team, invoking my rights as a defrauded guarantor. She was demanding access to the exact servers where he had been hiding the transfers to the Cayman Islands. She was demanding the ledgers for the fake maintenance companies. "She knows," Preston whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking with pure terror. She knows everything. The arrogant facade he had worn his entire life shattered instantly. The reality of his situation collapsed on him with the weight of a falling building. He was not facing a disappointed sister. He was facing a corporate executioner. Panic hijacked his brain. He leaped out of his leather chair and slammed his office door shut, throwing the deadbolt. He rushed back to his desk, his breathing ragged and erratic. He grabbed his phone and dialed Nia, but it went straight to voicemail. He threw the phone onto the desk. He had to hide the evidence. He had 48 hours before my auditors ripped his company apart. Preston frantically logged into his administrative terminal. He tried to delete the routing numbers for the offshore accounts, but his hands were shaking so badly he kept mistyping his own password. When he finally accessed the hidden ledger, he started desperately highlighting rows of wire transfers, hitting the delete key over and over again. He grabbed a stack of physical bank statements from his bottom drawer and shoved them blindly into the paper shredder, the loud whirring of the machine masking the sound of his own ragged breathing. He thought deleting local files would save him. He thought shredding paper would erase the trail. He was a fool playing a digital game against the CEO of a cybersecurity empire. Dominic had already cloned every byte of data from his server 4 hours ago. Preston collapsed back into his chair, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. The shredded paper filled the bin. The local files were wiped, but the heavy legal binder still sat on his desk, a glaring reminder that his world was ending. He stared at the signature at the bottom of the cease and desist letter. My signature bold, aggressive, and entirely unforgiving. The weak college dropout he had slapped just 24 hours ago now held his entire life in the palm of her hand, and he finally realized she was going to crush it. The security intercom in my penthouse chimed softly, breaking the quiet concentration of my evening. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glowing city skyline. Dominic and Gideon had already left, leaving me alone to monitor the digital fallout of our legal strike. I walked over to the security panel and pressed the speaker button. My private concierge sounded clearly uncomfortable. Miss Sterling, your sister-in-law is in the lobby. She bypassed the outer gate by tailgating a delivery truck and is currently demanding to be let up to your residence. She is causing a scene. I glanced at the security feed. Nia was pacing back and forth in the marble lobby with her face in her hands, playing the role of a devastated wife for anyone passing by. She had completely bypassed calling the lawyers. She knew Gideon would annihilate her. She thought she could manipulate me directly by playing on the family guilt she assumed I still harbored. Send her up, I instructed calmly. I unlocked the private elevator access, poured myself another glass of sparkling water, and waited. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open a minute later. Nia stepped directly into my foyer. The performance she delivered was Oscar-worthy. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her makeup was carefully smudged beneath her eyes, indicating recent, profound tears. Yet her outfit remained impeccably curated. She wore a tailored cream cashmere coat over a silk blouse, projecting wealth even in her manufactured misery. Cassidy, she sobbed, rushing a few steps forward before stopping as if intimidated by the cold emptiness of my penthouse. Please, you have to call off your lawyers. You have to stop this. I did not offer her a seat. I did not offer her a drink. I simply stood by the marble kitchen island, taking a slow sip of my water, waiting for her to play her hand. Preston called me from the office. Nia cried, her voice cracking with perfect dramatic timing. He was hyperventilating. He showed me the legal binder your team sent. I know what he did. I know he forged your signature. It was a terrible, desperate mistake, but he only did it to save his father's company. He was trying to protect the family legacy. She took a step closer, clasping her hands together in a pleading gesture. If you report that forged signature to the federal authorities, Preston is going to prison. He will be locked in a federal penitentiary for years. My children will grow up without a father. Do you understand what that means? You will destroy 2 innocent kids who love their uncle. You will ruin my family completely. Her breath hitched again, and she wiped a single tear from her cheek. Cassidy, you are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Your cybersecurity firm makes more money in a month than that entire loan is worth. You can afford the $3 million. You could pay off that shadow bank tomorrow and not even notice the money is gone. Do not destroy my family over cash. Please, be the bigger person and let this go. I remained in complete silence. The stillness in the penthouse grew heavy, stretching until it became profoundly uncomfortable. Nia shifted, clearly unnerved by my lack of response. She expected me to yell. She expected me to cry, or argue, or show some crack of emotional vulnerability she could exploit. My absolute stillness was throwing her off her script. My eyes slowly slid downward, analyzing every detail of her appearance. I looked at the diamond studs in her ears. I looked at the limited edition Cartier bracelet resting on her wrist. And then my gaze locked onto the handbag she had been clutching tightly to her side throughout her entire emotional monologue. It was a Hermes Birkin bag, specifically, a Himalayan crocodile Birkin with palladium hardware. As someone who routinely dealt with ultra-wealthy clients, I knew exactly what that bag cost. It was a $40,000 accessory. It was an item that required a massive purchase history and immense liquid capital just to be offered the chance to buy it. Nia noticed my stare. Her grip on the handle tightened defensively. Her knuckles turned slightly white. She tried to subtly shift the bag behind her cashmere coat, but the movement only highlighted the sheer absurdity of her presence in my home. "You are standing in my living room crying because your husband is facing federal prison for a $3 million fraud," I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You are begging me to pay off his criminal debt to save your innocent children. You are telling me that $3 million is pocket change for me." I set my water glass down on the marble counter with a sharp, definitive clink. "Yet you walked into my home carrying a handbag that costs more than the median annual salary in this country," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You are wearing $50,000 worth of jewelry on your wrists. You demand that I sacrifice my own capital to cover a high-interest, predatory loan your husband secured by committing identity theft against me." Nia opened her mouth to speak, but her previous tearful persona vanished instantly. The tears stopped. Her posture straightened. Her eyes hardened into a defensive, calculating glare. "I earned this bag," she snapped, her tone shifting entirely from a desperate mother to a ruthless real estate broker. "I work 60 hours a week, closing luxury commercial properties. My income is entirely separate from the logistics firm. I should not have to liquidate my hard-earned assets because Preston made a reckless decision to save his father. You have the liquidity to make this go away instantly without altering your lifestyle." I did not glare at her, letting the absolute delusion of her statement hang in the air. She wanted to play the victim of her husband's poor business decisions, while fiercely protecting the wealth she had hoarded. She thought her hands were clean. She thought she was just an innocent bystander, caught in the crossfire of family drama. But Dominic and I had not just looked at Preston's offshore accounts. We had mapped the entire financial ecosystem of Vanguard Logistics. I knew exactly how Nia afforded the Himalayan Birkin bag. I knew exactly how she funded her luxury lifestyle. And I knew her hands were just as dirty as the man she was trying to protect. I reached across the kitchen island and picked up a manila folder Gideon had left behind. It was time to pull the rug out from under her completely. I flipped the manila folder open and dropped it onto the marble island. The glossy pages fanned out, catching the ambient light of the penthouse. "Take a look, Nia," I instructed, my voice flat and commanding. "Tell me again about your completely separate income." Nia stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the floor. She picked up the top document. It was a ledger not from Vanguard Logistics, but from her own highly praised luxury real estate brokerage. Her eyes scanned the highlighted lines, and the remaining color drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her jaw clenched, the muscles ticking visibly beneath her skin. I did not give her time to process the shock or formulate a lie. My analyst spent the morning tracking the $8 million. Preston siphoned out of my father's firm, I said, pacing slowly behind the kitchen counter, keeping my gaze locked on her. "We found the offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. We found the gambling syndicate. But Preston is an amateur. He lost a few million at the tables, sure, but he is too much of a coward to burn through $8 million purely on bad hands. He needed a way to bring a large chunk of that cash back onto American soil without triggering the IRS. He needed to launder it." I pointed to the second document in her shaking hands. "That is exactly where you came in, Nia," I continued, my voice echoing in the vast, quiet space of the living room. "We tracked $3 million flowing from Preston's offshore shell companies directly into escrow accounts managed by your luxury brokerage. You orchestrated the purchase of 4 practically abandoned commercial lots in the industrial district using anonymous limited liability companies as buyers. You used your industry credentials to artificially inflate the appraisals on those worthless properties by 400%. Preston's stolen money bought the lots, and your brokerage collected a massive, completely legal-looking commission on every single transaction." Nia's eyes darted rapidly across the pages. Searching for a flaw in the data, a loophole she could exploit. She found none. The documentation was bulletproof. You kept an absolute fortune, I said, driving the truth home with lethal precision. You took the stolen money that belonged to my father's company, money meant for blue-collar truckers' payroll, and you washed it through bogus commercial real estate deals. You used those massive fraudulent commissions to fund your glamorous lifestyle. That is how you bought the $40,000 Birkin bag. That is how you afford the Cartier jewelry. You are not a separate, innocent, hard-working wife. You are the spin cycle in Preston's washing machine. Nia dropped the papers back onto the cold marble. The facade of the desperate, weeping mother evaporated into thin air. Her shoulders squared, and her posture shifted completely as her true, ruthless nature surfaced. Her eyes turned icy, calculating, and vicious. The woman standing in front of me was no longer pleading for the sake of her children. She was a cornered predator ready to strike back. You have no idea who you are dealing with, Nia hissed, her voice abandoning the frantic, tearful pitch from moments before. You think you are an untouchable tech genius because you hired a few hackers to run basic searches? You crossed a massive line, Cassidy. She took a confident step toward me, wielding her anger like a weapon. Accessing those escrow accounts requires breaching secure financial servers. That is not corporate due diligence. That is illegal corporate espionage. You hacked into confidential banking systems to get this information. I watched her construct her counterattack in real time. She was sharp. I had to give her that. She knew the law well enough to understand how financial privacy worked, but she fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield we were standing on. My legal team will tear you apart, Nia threatened, her chest heaving with furious determination. You accessed confidential banking records without a warrant. I am filing an injunction against your little cybersecurity firm tomorrow morning. I am reporting you to the federal authorities for cybercrimes. I will have your business licenses permanently revoked, and I will sue you for defamation and data theft until you are living back in that roach-infested studio apartment you crawled out of. She stood there, breathing heavily, clutching her designer bag, waiting for me to back down. She expected me to panic at the threat of federal exposure. She expected the mention of my past poverty to make me flinch. She thought she had found my weak spot. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile that made her fierce expression falter. I leaned against the marble counter, completely relaxed, and let out a soft, mocking laugh. You are threatening to report me to the federal authorities? I said, shaking my head in mild disbelief. Nia, who exactly do you think pays my company to secure the state's financial network? We do not hack banks. We design the architecture that protects them. Everything in that folder was pulled directly from publicly filed property deeds, county tax records, and registered agent P.O. boxes. You were arrogant. You filed the paperwork under your own brokerage license because you never thought anyone would bother connecting the dots between your husband's failing logistics firm and your sudden spike in luxury commercial sales. You left a digital trail a mile wide, and my team simply walked right down it. Nia's confidence shattered. Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. The realization that she had no legal leverage, no counterattack, and no escape route finally hit her. But please, I added, my smile fading into a look of absolute chilling indifference. Call the authorities. Report me for corporate espionage. I would love to see the look on the federal agents' faces when you invite them to audit your real estate escrow accounts. Nia's face crumbled. The color drained entirely from her flawless complexion, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She opened her mouth to argue, to launch another empty threat, but the absolute certainty in my eyes silenced her. She clutched her $40,000 Birkin bag to her chest like a shield, turned on her heel, and practically ran back to the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing away her panic and her collapsing world. I stood alone in the quiet of my penthouse, listening to the soft hum of the city far below. The confrontation had played out exactly as I had anticipated. Nia was neutralizing herself, paralyzed by the fear of federal prison. Before I could even pour myself another glass of water, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the marble island. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I knew exactly what this was. Preston had panicked when the process server delivered Gideon's legal binder. Nia had probably called him in hysterics the second she hit the lobby of my building. They were out of moves, so they had run to their protectors. I answered the call, hitting the speakerphone button and leaving the phone on the counter. Cassidy, what the hell are you doing? My father roared, his voice distorted by sheer volume and panic. I did not say a word, Just listen to the chaotic background noise on the other end of the line. I could hear my mother weeping hysterically, the sound grating on my nerves. Call off your lawyers right now, Richard demanded, his breath heavy and ragged. Preston just called me. He is having a panic attack in his office. You sent a demand for a forensic audit. You are threatening him with federal fraud charges over a simple signature. A simple signature, I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously calm. He forged my name, my social security number, and my old address to secure a $3 million predatory loan from a shadow bank. He committed aggravated identity theft. He was trying to save the company, my mother shrieked, snatching the phone from my father. Beatrice's voice was shrill, completely stripped of the cultured elegance she projected at her charity galas. He made a mistake because he was under immense pressure. He is your brother. How can you be so incredibly vicious? I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, letting the magnitude of their hypocrisy wash over me. They were not horrified that their golden boy had committed a major felony. They were not sickened that he had weaponized my identity and exposed me to millions of dollars in illegal debt. They were furious at me for fighting back. You have more money than you could ever need, Beatrice continued, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine. You could pay off that loan tomorrow and not even notice the money is gone. You are punishing him out of spite. You are punishing us. Pay the loan, Cassidy. Drop the investigation immediately. If you drag this family into a public scandal, if you put your brother in a courtroom, you will kill your father with the shame. Do you want his heart to stop? Do you want to be responsible for that? The weaponized guilt was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. For 20 years, that exact tone had kept me cowering in the corners of their suburban mansion. It was the voice that told me I was too sensitive, too broken, too much of a burden. But as I listened to Beatrice sob and Richard demand compliance, a profound, chilling realization settled in. I closed my eyes, piecing together the timeline. The lunch at Jean-Georges, the desperate plea for an angel investment, the perfectly choreographed attempt to bring me back into the family fold. You knew, I stated flatly. The tears on the other end of the line faltered. The sudden silence from my parents was deafening. You knew about the debt, I continued, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. You did not find out about the $3 million loan today. You knew Vanguard Logistics was bleeding out. You knew Preston was drowning. That is why you invited me to lunch. You did not want to build bridges. You knew your son had committed federal fraud, and you needed a blind, wealthy piggy bank to bail him out before the shadow lenders broke his legs. Cassidy, listen to me, Richard stammered, his commanding tone collapsing into a desperate backpedal. The supply chain issues hit us hard. We just needed a temporary bridge loan. Preston thought he could turn the capital around and pay it back before you ever found out. It was a victimless crime. A victimless crime, I repeated, a cold, humorless laugh escaping my chest. He embezzled $8 million of your operating capital and washed it through offshore gambling rings. His wife laundered the rest through her luxury real estate brokerage to buy sports cars and designer handbags. He did not take out that loan to save your company, Richard. He took it out to cover his gambling debts, and he used my name because his credit is absolute garbage. No, Beatrice gasped, genuine shock finally puncturing her denial. No, that is not true. Preston said it was for the truck fleet. He lied to you, I said, feeling absolutely no pity for the shattered woman on the other end of the phone. He lied to you. He stole from you. And then you both tried to help him steal from me. Cassidy, please, my father begged, his voice breaking. We will lose everything. The house, the company, our reputation. You have to save us. We are your family. I picked up the phone from the marble counter. I looked out at the glowing skyline, feeling the last invisible thread tying me to these people snap completely. When I was starving, you told me it was a lesson in independence, I said, quoting his own brutal philosophy back to him. I learned the lesson, Richard. I learned it so well that I built an empire you could never dream of touching. Now it is your turn. But the scandal, Beatrice sobbed. How will we show our faces? You won't, I replied with absolute finality. I am not your piggy bank. I am your biggest creditor. And I am going to demolish your company down to the foundation. I hit the end call button, opened my contacts, selected my father's number, and tapped block. I did the same for my mother. I set the phone down on the counter and exhaled a long, steady breath. The emotional detachment was complete. They had made their choices, and now they were going to drown in the consequences. I turned and walked toward my home office, my mind already shifting to the next phase of the operation. It was time to execute the corporate takeover. I walked into my home office. The heavy oak doors sealed off the rest of the penthouse. The glowing monitors of my workstation illuminated the darkened room, casting sharp shadows against the walls. I sat down in my leather chair and stared at the digital dossier Dominic had compiled. The evidence was irrefutable. I had the offshore wire transfers, the forged signature, and the real estate money laundering trails. One email to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Preston would be in handcuffs before midnight. But as I hovered my cursor over my encrypted email client, I paused. Sending Preston to federal prison was the obvious move, but it was fundamentally flawed. Prison was just a physical cage. For people like Richard and Beatrice, their true oxygen was their social status. Their entire existence revolved around country club memberships, charity galas, and the generational prestige of Vanguard Logistics. If I simply handed Preston over to the authorities, my parents would instantly weaponize the tragedy. They would hire expensive PR firms to paint themselves as the heartbroken victims of a troubled, wayward son. They would frame me as the estranged, vindictive daughter who kicked her family when they were down. They would keep their Greenwich mansion, their cars, and their carefully crafted victim narrative. I refused to let them keep their illusion. I needed them to lose the only thing they truly loved. I needed to take the company. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Gideon. He answered on the first ring, the background noise of his Wall Street firm buzzing through the receiver. "Hold the federal warrants," I ordered, my voice carrying the absolute certainty of a corporate executioner. "We are shifting the strategy." Gideon chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "I had a feeling you would say that. What is the new play, Cassidy?" "We are going to execute a hostile takeover of Vanguard Logistics," I explained, pulling up the list of creditors Dominic had scraped from their hidden ledgers. "But we are not going to fight them in the boardroom for shares. We are going to buy their debt, every last dime of it." There was a brief silence on the line as Gideon processed the magnitude of the move. Buying distressed corporate debt was a common tactic for aggressive hedge funds, but deploying it as a weapon for personal revenge was entirely different. "You want to become their primary creditor," Gideon stated, his tone shifting into pure, predatory business mode. "You want to own the paper on their warehouses, their fleets, and their operating loans." "I want to own their absolute survival," I corrected. Preston leveraged the firm to the brink of collapse to cover his offshore gambling. He took out predatory loans from shadow banks in Chicago. He mortgaged the shipping hubs. He put liens on the truck fleet. "I want you to deploy capital from my private equity reserve and buy out every single one of those lenders. Offer them a premium if they transfer the paper quietly and immediately." Gideon started typing rapidly on his end. "The shadow banks will sell the paper without a second thought if we offer them 10 cents on the dollar over the principal. They do not care about Vanguard Logistics. They just want to guarantee their high-interest returns. But we need to use a proxy holding company. If Preston or Richard see your name or the Aegis Data Defense banner on the debt transfer notices, they will panic and immediately file for bankruptcy to halt collections. Set up a blind trust in Delaware," I instructed. "Call it Apex Recovery Holdings. Let them think their debt just got bundled and sold to a faceless corporate restructuring firm. I want the transition to be completely invisible to them." "Consider it done," Gideon said. "I will have my associates drafting the acquisition contracts tonight. We start with the Chicago firm holding the forged $3 million loan. Once we possess that specific piece of paper, we legally hold the high ground on the identity theft. Then we sweep the shipping hub mortgages and the commercial vehicle liens. Give me 48 hours, Cassidy. I will bring you the deed to their entire empire." I ended the call and leaned back in my chair. The next 2 days were a masterclass in silent financial warfare. While my parents frantically tried to figure out how to handle the fallout of our phone call, my capital moved like a ghost through the financial sector. Gideon executed the buyouts with ruthless efficiency. The Chicago Shadow Bank happily handed over the forged loan document the second our wire transfer cleared their accounts. The commercial real estate lenders, who were already growing nervous about Vanguard Logistics missing grace periods, eagerly dumped the warehouse mortgages onto our blind trust. The fleet financiers surrendered the vehicle titles. Millions of dollars flowed out of my private reserves, converting liquid cash into weaponized leverage. I did not flinch at the cost. The money was simply a tool, a sharpened blade I was using to prune the rotting branches off my family tree. By Thursday evening, I was standing in my home office when the secure fax machine whirred to life. Heavy, notarized documents began spilling into the receiving tray. I picked up the thick stack of paper. They were the finalized transfer agreements stamped, countersigned, and legally binding. I spread the documents out across my mahogany desk. There was the deed to the primary shipping hub in New Jersey. There was the title registry for over 200 commercial transport vehicles. And sitting dead center, like a loaded gun, was the original $3 million loan contract bearing my forged signature. I ran my finger over the fraudulent ink. Preston thought this signature was his ultimate safety net. He thought he had cleverly shifted the burden of his crimes onto the sister he despised. He had no idea he had just handed me the master key to his destruction. My phone lit up with a text from Gideon. "The board is set," the message read. Apex Recovery Holdings now owns 85% of all Vanguard Logistics' outstanding liabilities. You are officially the majority debt holder. I locked my phone and stared out the window at the sprawling city. Somewhere in the wealthy suburbs, Richard, Beatrice, and Preston were sitting in their mansion, completely oblivious. They still thought they were the masters of their universe. They thought they were dealing with standard aggressive lenders who could be stalled with empty promises and creative accounting. They did not know that the faceless corporation holding their survival in its hands was actually the daughter they had thrown away. The trap was fully constructed. The doors were locked from the outside, and they had absolutely no idea the executioner was already inside the house. The digital files were organized with meticulous care. Every transaction, every forged document, every piece of evidence pointing to Preston and Naya's sprawling criminal enterprise was encrypted and loaded onto 2 separate drives. I did not use email. I did not trust the cloud for this. The magnitude of what I was about to initiate required a physical handoff. I reached out to 2 associates I had cultivated over years of providing top-tier data intelligence to government agencies. The first was Special Agent Miller, of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. The second was Director Vance from IRS Criminal Investigation. They were serious, unyielding individuals who appreciated the absolute precision of my firm. I arranged to meet them in a secure, neutral location, a private conference room at a high-end downtown hotel. I arrived early, the secure drives in my briefcase. When Miller and Vance arrived, they were all business, their expressions serious and focused. We had worked together on major operations before, but they knew this was different. This was personal. I placed the first drive on the table, sliding it toward Agent Miller. This contains the complete, uncensored financial history of Vanguard Logistics over the last 3 years. You will find irrefutable proof of $8 million embezzled and laundered through offshore gambling syndicates in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. $8 million is a substantial operation. Who is the primary target? The CEO, Preston Sterling. I replied, my voice steady. My brother also committed aggravated identity theft, using my social security number and a forged signature to secure a $3 million predatory loan to cover his initial losses. Miller picked up the drive, his expression hardening. We will verify the data, but if this is as airtight as your usual work, we can have a warrant drafted by tomorrow morning. I nodded, shifting my attention to Director Vance. I slid the second drive across the mahogany table. This one is for you, Director. The embezzlement was just the source of funds. The money laundering operation is much closer to home. You will find a comprehensive audit of a luxury real estate brokerage run by Nia Sterling, my sister-in-law. Vance leaned forward, his interest piqued. Real estate. Classic. She used anonymous LLCs to buy practically worthless commercial lots, inflating the appraisals by 400%, I explained, breaking down the mechanics of the scheme. Nia washed $3 million of the stolen cash through those transactions, keeping massive commissions to fund her personal lifestyle. She evaded taxes on the illicit income and filed fraudulent corporate returns. The trail is completely visible in public property deeds and the escrow accounts she foolishly tied to her own brokerage license. Vance took the drive, tapping it thoughtfully against the table. We will freeze her assets immediately. A scheme that brazen will trigger a full federal audit of her entire brokerage history. She will be stripped of her license before the week is out. Both men looked at me, clearly understanding the gravity of what I was handing them. They were ready to move, to send teams of agents to tear my family's lives apart. We can coordinate the arrests, Miller said, already pulling out his phone. We can have teams at Vanguard Logistics headquarters and the real estate brokerage simultaneously. We can execute the operation in 24 hours. No, I said sharply, raising a hand to stop him. Miller paused, looking at me with a mix of confusion and professional caution. Cassidy, this is a massive fraud case. We cannot sit on this kind of evidence. Flight risk is a serious concern, especially with offshore accounts involved. They are not going anywhere, I assured him. They are arrogant and currently believe they are untouchable. They think they are dealing with standard creditors. They have no idea I am the one holding the leash. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. I need you to hold the warrants for 48 hours. Vance frowned, exchanging a skeptical look with Miller. That is highly irregular. Why the delay? Because they have called an emergency shareholder meeting for Friday morning, I explained, the plan crystal clear in my mind. They are going to attempt a desperate maneuver to save themselves. They are going to try to strip me of my minority shares by declaring me mentally incapacitated, weaponizing my past struggles against me. They want to liquidate my stock to cover the massive hole Preston dug. They want to humiliate me publicly to solidify their control. And you want to be there when the hammer falls, Miller observed, a faint smile touching his lips. I do not just want to be there, I corrected. I am now the majority debt holder of Vanguard Logistics. I bought out all their creditors through a blind trust. When they try to execute their little coup, I am going to foreclose on their entire empire in front of their board of directors. I want to shatter their illusion of power before you strip them of their freedom. Vance leaned back in his chair, a look of profound respect crossing his face. A corporate execution followed by federal indictments. It is brutal, Cassidy, but highly effective. I want to deliver the warrants myself, I said, looking dead into Agent Miller's eyes. I want to be the one standing in the boardroom when you walk in with the handcuffs. I want my brother and my parents to know exactly who ended them. Miller considered the request for a long moment. He knew protocol, but he also knew the value of the intelligence I had provided over the years. I had handed them an open and shut case tied with a bow. 48 hours. Miller finally agreed, tucking the drive into his suit jacket pocket. We will have the paperwork finalized and the agents on standby. Friday morning, we will be waiting in the lobby of Vanguard Logistics. You give the signal. And we move in. Thank you, gentlemen, I said, standing up and smoothing my suit jacket. I left the hotel and stepped out into the bustling city streets. The machinery of their destruction was fully in motion. The federal government was now quietly preparing to dismantle Preston and Nia's fraudulent lives. My family was spending their final days of freedom plotting my downfall, completely unaware that the executioners were already sharpening their blades. The next 48 hours were agonizingly slow, but charged with a dark, electric anticipation. I spent the time perfecting the presentation I would deliver to the Vanguard Logistics Board of Directors. Dominic and I polished the graphics, ensuring the flow of embezzled funds was visually undeniable. We linked the fraudulent loans, the fake maintenance companies, and the offshore gambling accounts into a cohesive, devastating narrative. Gideon handled the final legal preparations for the hostile takeover. He drafted the foreclosure notices, the asset seizure documents, and the formal termination papers for Preston's role as CEO. We left them not a single legal loophole. We were building a titanium cage. By Thursday night, everything was perfectly aligned. I stood by the windows of my penthouse, watching the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. The trap was set. The bait was in place. Tomorrow morning, Richard and Preston would walk into their boardroom believing they were kings of their domain. They would walk out in handcuffs, completely ruined. The endgame had finally arrived. Friday morning broke with the harsh gray light of an impending storm. Inside the executive suite of Vanguard Logistics, the atmosphere was equally turbulent. Preston stood before the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city, aggressively adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. His reflection showed a man pushed to the absolute breaking point. The dark circles under his eyes were impossible to conceal, a testament to 48 hours of pure, unadulterated panic. He had not slept since the process server dropped Gideon's legal binder on his desk. He had spent 2 days in a manic frenzy, shredding documents, consulting with expensive defense attorneys who only offered grim prognoses, and fielding hysterical phone calls from Nia, who was terrified of losing her real estate license and her precious social status. But Preston was an arrogant man, and arrogant men cornered by their own incompetence rarely surrender. They doubled down. Richard paced the length of the office, his usual commanding presence replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. He stopped near the wet bar, pouring himself a generous measure of scotch despite the early hour. He threw it back in one swallow, the amber liquid doing little to steady his shaking hands. "This has to work, Preston," Richard said, his voice strained. "The board members are already gathering in the main conference room. We have 3 major creditors demanding immediate payment by the end of the business day. If we do not stabilize the narrative and liquidate those minority shares, Vanguard is finished. I am finished. Preston turned away from the window, forcing a cold, confident smirk onto his face. It will work, Dad. Trust me. Cassidy is playing a dangerous game with her little cybersecurity firm, but she fundamentally misunderstands corporate governance. She thinks sending a scary legal binder makes her untouchable, but she is vulnerable. We just have to strike where she is weakest. Richard frowned, setting his empty glass down with a sharp clink. You mean her mental history? Exactly. Preston scoffed, moving toward the conference table where he had laid out his battle plan. He picked up a thick file folder, the contents of which were a meticulously crafted fiction designed to destroy his sister. We control the narrative in that boardroom. Cassidy is not a victim of identity theft. She is an unstable, estranged daughter, suffering from a severe, recurring psychological breakdown. She dropped out of college because she could not handle the pressure. Remember, she was hospitalized for exhaustion. We will present her claims of forgery and embezzlement as the paranoid delusions of a sick woman desperate for attention. Richard hesitated, a flash of genuine discomfort crossing his face. But the evidence she sent, the offshore transfers, the fabricated loan documents, are forged, Preston interrupted sharply, waving his hand dismissively. She runs a data intelligence firm, Dad. We will tell the board she manipulated digital records to frame us out of pure spite. It is a brilliant, tragic story. The poor, sick girl trying to bring down her family's empire because she was written out of the primary inheritance structure. The board is full of old-school traditionalists. They value stability. They value the Vanguard name. They will never side with an estranged, unstable woman over established leadership. Preston's plan was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. He had completely convinced himself that his lies could outrun the irrefutable digital footprint he had left behind. He believed weaponizing my past, the very trauma they had inflicted on me, would be the silver bullet that saved his skin. We will propose a motion of no confidence regarding her minority shares, Preston continued, his voice gaining momentum as he sold the lie to his father and himself. We will argue that her mental instability poses an active, severe threat to the company's reputation and operational security. We will force a vote to involuntarily liquidate her shares and return the capital to the general operating fund. We will use her own money to pay off the shadow bank, stabilize the immediate debt, and close this chapter forever. Richard nodded slowly, the desperation in his eyes solidifying into a hardened resolve. It is harsh, but it is necessary. She left us no choice when she threatened the family legacy. We have to protect Vanguard at all costs. Preston picked up the file folder, his confidence completely restored. He checked his reflection one last time, ensuring his tie was perfectly straight and his posture projected unwavering authority. Let us go. It is time to put an end to this little rebellion. The main conference room of Vanguard Logistics was a cavernous space designed to intimidate. A massive mahogany table stretched down the center, surrounded by plush leather chairs. The walls were lined with framed photographs of the company's expanding fleet and historical milestones. The board of directors, 12 men and women representing the old guard of the city's logistics and financial sectors, were already seated. The mood was tense. Rumors of the firm's financial instability had inevitably started to circulate, and the emergency nature of the meeting only heightened the anxiety. Preston and Richard entered the room with practiced ease. Preston took his place at the head of the table, projecting an aura of calm command. Richard sat to his immediate right, the stoic patriarch supporting his heir. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Preston began, his voice projecting across the quiet room. He offered a reassuring, slightly solemn smile. I know there have been whispers. I know the sudden call for an emergency meeting has caused some concern. I want to assure you immediately that Vanguard Logistics' core operations are rock solid. We are facing a challenge, yes, but it is not structural. It is personal. The board members leaned forward, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Preston opened his file folder, placing his hands flat on the table, leaning into his performance. It is with a heavy heart that I must address a deeply sensitive family matter that has unfortunately spilled over into our corporate sphere. Many of you know my sister Cassidy, or rather, you knew her before she estranged herself from the family over a decade ago. He paused, letting a look of profound, manufactured sadness cross his features. Cassidy has a documented history of severe mental health struggles. She dropped out of college due to a complete psychological breakdown. For years, my parents and I have tried to offer her support, but she has consistently rejected our help. choosing instead to isolate herself. Murmurs rippled through the boardroom. The older directors exchanged sympathetic looks with Richard, who bowed his head slightly, playing the tragic father to perfection. Recently, her condition has deteriorated significantly, Preston continued, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. She has developed severe paranoid delusions regarding our family and this company. She has retained an aggressive attorney and is currently making wild, completely unfounded accusations of financial fraud and identity theft against me and my father. She claims we forged her signature to secure corporate loans. She claims we are embezzling funds. Preston shook his head sadly, closing the file folder. It is tragic, truly, but it is also incredibly dangerous. She runs a cybersecurity firm, and she has threatened to use her resources to fabricate digital evidence against us if we do not surrender to her demands. She is attempting to extort her own family. The boardroom erupted in quiet outrage. The directors were buying the narrative exactly as Preston had calculated. They were appalled by the audacity of the estranged daughter and sympathetic to the embattled executives trying to protect their legacy. Therefore, Preston said, raising his voice to cut through the chatter, to protect Vanguard Logistics from this aggressive, unstable extortion attempt, I propose an immediate motion of no confidence regarding Cassidy's minority shares. We must vote to involuntarily liquidate her position to prevent her from using her leverage to further damage the firm's reputation and financial standing. It is a difficult decision, but it is necessary for the survival of the company. Preston stood tall at the head of the table, his chest puffed out with victory. He had delivered his checkmate. He had successfully painted me as a delusional extortionist and positioned himself as the savior of the firm. He glanced at his father, a smirk of self-satisfaction playing on his lips. He was entirely confident the board would vote with him, the shares would be liquidated, and the nightmare would be over. He was oblivious to the fact that the nightmare had not even begun. The chairman of the board, an older man named Harrison, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the motion Preston had just distributed. Well, given the severity of these allegations and the clear risk to Vanguard Logistics, I propose we move forward with an immediate vote to liquidate the minority shares currently held by Cassidy Sterling. Richard smiled, leaning back in his leather chair. Preston gripped the edges of the podium, his chest swelling with a triumphant, arrogant breath. He had done it. He was saved. Then, the heavy mahogany double doors of the conference room were not just opened. They were thrust apart with such sudden, violent force that the brass handles struck the interior walls with a deafening crack. The entire board jumped in their seats. Richard spilled his scotch across the polished wood. Preston jerked back, his hands flying off the podium. I walked into the room. I was not wearing the casual clothes of a depressed, runaway college dropout. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored black blazer over a silk blouse, my hair pulled back into a severe, flawless style. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a slow, predatory rhythm. The overwhelming silence of the room amplified my every step. I did not come alone. To my immediate right walked Gideon, my Wall Street litigator, carrying a thick, locked leather briefcase containing my family's absolute financial ruin. To my left walked Special Agent Miller of the FBI, his badge clipped visibly to his belt. Beside him was Director Vance of IRS Criminal Investigation, his face a mask of total, unyielding authority. The air in the boardroom turned to ice. The 12 wealthy directors who had just seconds ago been nodding along to Preston's fabricated story were now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. They recognized federal agents when they saw them. They recognized power. Richard was the first to break the paralysis. He leaped out of his chair, his face flushing a violent shade of purple. "Security," he bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "How did you get past the front desk? You have absolutely no right to be here. Get out of my building before you are arrested for trespassing." Agent Miller stepped forward, barely sparing my father a glance. "Take a seat, sir. We are executing a federal warrant. Anyone interfering will be charged with obstruction of justice." Richard collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had been cut out from under him. The color drained entirely from his face. Preston was hyperventilating at the podium. His eyes darted wildly from me, to the federal agents, to the locked briefcase in Gideon's hand. His perfectly constructed narrative of the delusional, unstable sister was disintegrating in real time. I ignored my father. I ignored my brother. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead and walked the length of the massive mahogany table. The board members practically shrank back into their expensive leather chairs as I passed. I reached the opposite head of the table, standing directly across from Preston down the long expanse of polished wood. I pulled out the heavy executive chair, sat down, and crossed my legs. I placed my hands flat on the table, projecting an absolute, chilling stillness. Preston gripped the podium, desperate to salvage his crumbling lie. He looked wildly at the board members. "You see it?" Preston stammered, his voice high and frantic. "This is exactly what I was talking about. She is unstable. She hired actors to dress up as federal agents to intimidate us. She is having a psychotic break right in front of you. We have to vote on the liquidation immediately." Chairman Harrison looked at Preston, then looked at the two federal agents standing like stone pillars behind my chair. Harrison was an old-school conservative who had survived 4 decades of corporate warfare. He was not an idiot. He looked back at me, his voice trembling slightly. "Young lady, who are you?" I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that offered absolutely no mercy. "My name is Cassidy," I said, my voice projecting effortlessly across the dead-silent room. "I am the founder and CEO of Aegis Data Defense. The man to my right is Gideon Thorne, senior partner at one of the most aggressive corporate litigation firms in Manhattan. The men behind me are verified federal agents with the FBI and the IRS. You may inspect their credentials if you wish, but I assure you, they are very real." I leaned slightly forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I understand my brother has just spent the last 20 minutes entertaining you with a creative fairy tale about my mental health," I continued, staring dead into Preston's panicking eyes. "He told you I was a delusional dropout. He told you I was trying to extort this company. He told you to liquidate my shares to protect the Vanguard legacy." I shifted my gaze to Chairman Harrison. "He lied to you, Harrison. He lied to every single one of you. He is not trying to protect this company from me. He is trying to use you to protect himself from a federal prison sentence." The boardroom erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. The directors stared at Preston with mounting horror. They had been minutes away from signing a legally binding document based on fraudulent claims. Richard slammed his fist on the table, trying to summon whatever fractured authority he had left. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is a vindictive, bitter child trying to destroy her own flesh and blood out of spite. She has no proof of anything." "Proof," Gideon chuckled, stepping forward and placing the heavy leather briefcase dead center on the mahogany table. The metallic click of the locks echoed loudly. "Richard, we did not come here to debate. We came to conduct an execution." I looked at my brother, whose knuckles were paper white as he clung to the wooden podium. He was suffocating in his own trap, and I was about to drop the anvil. "I am not here as a minority shareholder," I announced, my voice cutting through the remaining whispers until the room was dead silent once again. "I do not care about the shares you were trying to steal from me, because as of 9 o'clock this morning, those shares are completely worthless," I signaled Gideon. He snapped the briefcase open and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the table with a heavy thud. "You are not voting on anything today," I told the terrified board of directors, "because Vanguard Logistics no longer belongs to Richard or Preston." Preston slammed his hand against the wooden podium. "Get her out of here!" he shrieked, his voice breaking wildly as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "Security! I am the CEO of this company, and I demand this trespasser be removed." "She is lying. It is a fabrication." Gideon did not even blink. He reached into the leather briefcase and pulled out a dozen thick, professionally bound folders. He walked around the massive mahogany table, casually tossing one to each seated board member. "Read them carefully," Gideon instructed, his voice a low, gravelly hum that demanded absolute obedience. "You will find the complete transfer of deeds, mezzanine debt contracts, and commercial liens on every single asset Vanguard Logistics owns." Chairman Harrison opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the top document. His face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray in a matter of seconds. "Apex Recovery Holdings," he whispered, looking up at Richard. "Richard, you told us the debt restructuring was being handled internally. Who is Apex Recovery Holdings?" "I am," I replied softly, my voice cutting through the heavy air of the boardroom. I stood up slowly from my chair at the head of the table. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. "I am not here as a minority shareholder," I announced, ensuring every director heard the absolute finality in my words. "I am your largest creditor. Through my private equity trust, I bought out every single shadow lender, every commercial mortgage, and every high-interest loan my brother desperately took out to keep this company afloat. I own the paper on your shipping hubs in New Jersey. I own the titles to your entire transport fleet. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, due to gross financial negligence and missed grace periods, they are in default, Richard gasped, clutching his chest. He staggered backward, leaning against the edge of his leather chair. You bought the debt? He babbled, looking at me as if he were seeing a monster. You orchestrated a hostile takeover of your own family. You handed me the weapon. Richard, I replied coldly. I just pulled the trigger. Preston was shaking his head violently. It is a trick. He yelled at the board members. Do not look at those papers. She hacked the system. She fabricated the debt to steal the company. I did not argue with him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small encrypted remote drive. I walked over to the digital podium, unplugged Preston's presentation laptop, and slotted my drive directly into the boardroom's central projection system. The massive screen at the front of the room flickered. Preston's sterile, fabricated financial growth charts vanished. In their place, a high-definition map of global wire transfers illuminated the darkened room. Thick red lines connected Vanguard Logistics' corporate accounts to offshore banking havens in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. Let us look at exactly why Vanguard Logistics is in default, I ordered, stepping aside so the entire board could see the glaring evidence. Over the last 24 months, your brilliant CEO has siphoned $8 million out of your operating capital. The screen shifted, bringing up the registered agent documents of 5 phantom maintenance companies located in Delaware. He created shell companies, I explained, clicking to the next slide. He funneled your corporate cash through bogus vendor contracts, pretending he was paying for fleet maintenance. But the money did not go to mechanics. It went straight to unregulated offshore gambling syndicates. Preston lost $8 million of your money at the tables, and he hid the losses by leveraging your hard assets. The board members gasped. One woman covered her mouth in pure horror. The chairman stared at the screen, completely paralyzed. But $8 million is hard to hide from the IRS, I continued, my voice steady and unforgiving. So Preston needed a washing machine. I clicked the remote. The screen flickered again. This time, it displayed official property deeds, escrow accounts, and the luxury real estate brokerage license of Nia, Preston's wife. To bring the remaining stolen funds back into the country without raising suspicion, Preston utilized his wife's luxury real estate firm, I stated. Nia used anonymous LLCs to purchase worthless commercial lots, artificially inflating the appraisals by 400%. She laundered $3 million of your stolen money through those transactions. She kept massive fraudulent commissions to fund her designer lifestyle, evading federal taxes and committing wire fraud in the process. Richard turned to Preston, his eyes wide with a mix of betrayal and disbelief. You let Nia wash the money? Richard croaked, his voice shaking. You used the company to fund your gambling? Preston backed away from his father, his chest heaving. It was a temporary setup, he pleaded, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. I was going to win it back. I had a system. I just needed a little more time to turn the capital around. A system, the chairman repeated, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. You ruined a generational empire with a gambling system. I was not finished. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen went completely stark white. In the center appeared a single, high-resolution scan of a commercial loan agreement. It was the $3 million predatory contract from the Chicago Shadow Bank. When Preston finally ran out of liquid cash to steal, I said, dropping my voice to a lethal, quiet register, he turned to the ultimate betrayal. He needed a clean credit profile to secure a desperate loan from a shadow lender, so he dug up my old college records. I zoomed in on the bottom of the document. My forged signature glowed brightly on the massive screen. He committed aggravated identity theft, I announced. He forged my signature and used my social security number to co-sign a loan with a 22% interest rate. He tried to tie a $3 million anchor around my neck and throw me into the ocean to save himself. The absolute silence in the boardroom was heavier than concrete. The directors looked at Preston not just as a failed executive, but as a severe, undeniable criminal. You told us she was delusional, one board member whispered, staring at Preston with absolute disgust. You tried to get us to vote to steal her shares and cover up your federal crimes. Preston sank to his knees right there in front of the podium. His legs gave out completely. He covered his face with his hands, sobbing loudly. The arrogant facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. I stood over him, feeling no sympathy, no pity, and no hesitation. The financial execution was complete. The corporate facade was entirely demolished. Now it was the federal agents' turn to do their jobs. "Get up!" Richard roared, his face contorted into a mask of desperate fury. He stormed around the massive mahogany table, grabbing Preston by the shoulder and hauling his weeping son roughly to his feet. Richard turned his blazing eyes entirely on me, his chest heaving as if he could simply bully reality into bending to his will. "Enough! I have had enough of this vindictive tantrum. Cassidy, you made your point. You showed everyone how smart your little computers are. Now turn off that screen, take your corporate lawyers, and get out of my building." The board members looked at Richard as if he had lost his mind. He was completely disconnected from the gravity of the situation. He truly believed his parental authority still carried weight in a room suffocating under the burden of federal evidence. "We will handle this internally," Richard declared, projecting his voice to the horrified directors, trying to salvage a ship that was already resting at the bottom of the ocean. "It is a minor cash flow discrepancy. I will write a personal check to Apex Recovery Holdings by the end of the day. I will clear the debt, and Vanguard Logistics will resume normal operations. This is a private family matter that has been wildly blown out of proportion by a jealous, estranged daughter." I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my position at the head of the table. "You cannot write a check to fix this, Richard," I said, my tone absolute ice. "You do not have the liquid capital to cover an $8 million embezzlement, let alone the predatory loans and commercial mortgages I now own. Your personal accounts are tied to this company, and this company is dead. But more importantly, you cannot write a check to the federal government to buy your son out of a major felony." Agent Miller stepped forward, his polished black shoes echoing against the hardwood floor. His demeanor shifted from a silent observer to the full, terrifying manifestation of federal law enforcement. He unclipped his radio, muttered a brief command, and then locked his eyes firmly on my father. "Step away from the suspect, sir," Agent Miller ordered. His voice brokered no negotiation. Richard bristled, puffing out his chest to challenge the agent. "Suspect? This is my son. This is the CEO of this corporation. You have no jurisdiction here." Director Vance stood beside Miller, his presence equally imposing. "We have absolute jurisdiction, Richard. The funds your son siphoned crossed international borders into unregulated offshore accounts. The real estate transactions your wife used to launder that money violated strict federal tax codes. The loan he secured using a forged signature constituted aggravated identity theft across state lines. This stopped being a family matter the second he wired the first stolen dollar." Agent Miller reached around to the small of his back and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic, clinking sound seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the boardroom. The directors practically pressed themselves against the walls, desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding criminal nightmare. "Preston Sterling," Agent Miller said, his voice echoing with chilling official authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion." Preston let out a guttural, panicked sob. He flailed his arms wildly, trying to pull away from the advancing agents. "No! No! Please! Dad, do something! Tell them I was just trying to help the company. Dad, please do not let them take me." Richard stood paralyzed. The arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life bullying his way through corporate conflicts was finally facing a wall he could not simply buy off or intimidate. He watched with absolute, crushing horror as the two federal agents grabbed Preston by the arms, spun him around, and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany conference table. The impact rattled the expensive wood. Preston cried out in pain and terror. "Put your hands behind your back," Agent Miller commanded forcefully, twisting Preston's wrists. The sharp, unforgiving click of the handcuffs, ratcheting shut, echoed perfectly in the dead silent room. It was the sound of a generational empire ending. It was the sound of a golden boy losing his entire future in a matter of seconds. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Miller recited, hauling Preston up off the table by his bound arms. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Preston was openly weeping. Tears and sweat streamed down his flushed face. His expensive suit jacket was rumpled and twisted. The image of the invincible corporate heir was completely annihilated. He looked pathetic. He looked exactly like the cowardly, incompetent thief he had always been. Agent Miller and Director Vance began marching him toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom, the same doors Preston had confidently walked through just 30 minutes prior, believing he was about to orchestrate my financial ruin. As they dragged him down the center of the long table, I stepped out from my chair and moved directly into his path. The agents paused, allowing me one final moment. Preston looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot, wide with a desperate, pathetic plea. He was looking for a shred of sibling mercy, a tiny hint of the sister he thought he could trample without consequence. He opened his mouth, his lips trembling, perhaps preparing to beg for my forgiveness or plead with me to call off the legal dogs. I did not give him the chance. I looked him dead in the eye, my gaze stripped of any warmth, any pity, and any familial loyalty. I let him see the absolute, calculating void he had created when he cast me out of this family over a decade ago. I leaned in slightly, ensuring my voice was low enough for him to hear, but clear enough to pierce through his panic. I spoke the exact words he had screamed at me while slapping my face in front of the governor. "You do not belong here." Preston let out a choked, breathless gasp. The realization hit him with a final, crushing weight. There would be no bailout. There would be no redemption. He was completely finished. I stepped aside. Agent Miller shoved Preston forward, marching him out of the boardroom and down the executive hallway, where uniformed officers were already waiting by the elevators. I turned slowly back to the room. Chairman Harrison pulled off his glasses. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped them on the table. The remaining board members refused to make eye contact with me, their eyes glued to the empty space where Preston had just been handcuffed. They realized the depth of their own peril. They had been minutes away from acting as accomplices in a massive corporate cover-up. I walked back to the head of the table and placed my hands flat on the cool mahogany. The sound of Preston's distant crying faded as the elevator doors down the hall slid shut. "This meeting is adjourned," I announced, my voice a calm, relentless force. "My legal team will be in contact with each of you regarding the asset transition. Vanguard Logistics is now under the exclusive control of Apex Recovery Holdings. I suggest you all pack your briefcases and get out of my building." Not a single director argued. Not a single director looked to Richard for guidance. They stood up in unison, gathering their papers in terrified haste, and scrambled out the door, leaving my shattered father sitting completely alone in the wreckage of his stolen legacy. Across the city, in the heart of an ultra-exclusive gated community, the sprawling Sterling mansion was eerily quiet. Nia was standing in the center of her massive walk-in closet, surrounded by walls of custom shelving displaying hundreds of thousands of dollars in designer shoes and handbags. The 90-inch flat-screen TV mounted in the master bedroom was playing the local midday news. Nia was not paying attention to the broadcast until a breaking news chyron flashed across the bottom of the screen. The volume was low, but the aerial helicopter footage of Vanguard Logistics headquarters caught her attention instantly. She stepped out of the closet, the color draining from her flawless complexion as the news anchor announced a coordinated federal raid. The camera zoomed in on the front entrance of the corporate building. Nia watched with absolute paralyzing horror as her husband was marched out of the glass doors by 2 federal agents. Preston looked disheveled, openly weeping, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. Press cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing the complete destruction of the Sterling Empire's golden boy. Nia did not scream. She did not fall to her knees in grief for her husband. The second she saw the federal windbreakers, her survival instincts overrode whatever shred of marital loyalty she had left. "He was sloppy," Nia hissed to the empty room, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. She turned her back on the television screen and immediately sprang into action. There was no time for tears, and there was certainly no time to call a defense attorney for Preston. If the FBI was dragging him out of his own boardroom, the paper trail had been completely exposed. It was only a matter of time before they connected his offshore gambling losses to her luxury real estate brokerage. She needed to disappear, and she needed to do it before the authorities realized she was the architect of his money laundering machine. She dragged a massive, hard-shell Louis Vuitton trunk down from the top shelf of her closet and threw it open on the king-size bed. She bypassed her everyday clothes and went straight for the high-yield assets. She tossed in her velvet jewelry boxes packed with Cartier bracelets, diamond tennis necklaces, and rare Rolex watches. She grabbed the $40,000 Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag she had clutched like a shield in Cassidy's penthouse and shoved it into the suitcase. Her plan was incredibly simple and utterly ruthless. She would drive to the private airfield, charter a flight to a non-extradition jurisdiction, and immediately file for divorce from overseas. She would issue a public statement claiming she was the horrified, innocent wife who had been completely manipulated by a criminal husband. She would play the victim, keep the cash, and start over. She just needed to secure her liquidity. Nia rushed over to her mahogany vanity and flipped open her encrypted laptop. She logged into her luxury real estate brokerage's secure portal, intending to drain the remaining $400,000 hidden in a bogus escrow account. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing her administrative credentials. She hit enter and waited for the dashboard to load. Instead of her financial portfolio, the screen flashed a stark, blinding white. A harsh, red warning banner appeared dead center on the display. Access denied. Account frozen by order of IRS criminal investigation. Nia stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She frantically opened a new tab and tried to log into her personal offshore holding accounts. Access denied. She tried her domestic checking accounts. She tried her secondary corporate credit lines. Every single financial avenue was locked. The digital walls were closing in, trapping her inside the burning wreckage of the family she had tried to exploit. Cassidy had not just handed the files over to the FBI to arrest Preston. She had unleashed the IRS to execute a total financial freeze. Before Nia could even process the magnitude of her ruin, a violent, rhythmic pounding echoed from the first floor of the mansion. The heavy oak front doors shuddered under the force of the blows. IRS criminal investigation. Open the door immediately. Nia froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked wildly around the bedroom, her eyes landing on the half-packed Louis Vuitton trunk on her bed. She was trapped. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed up the grand staircase. They had breached the front doors. Heavy tactical boots pounded across the imported Italian marble of the foyer. Secure the perimeter. I want agents on every floor, a booming voice ordered. Nia stepped out of the master suite and stood at the top of the grand staircase, desperately trying to summon the arrogant authority that had always protected her in the business world. She gripped the oak railing, glaring down at the swarm of federal agents flooding her pristine home. What is the meaning of this? Nia shouted, projecting a manufactured, indignant fury. Do you have any idea whose house you are destroying? I am a licensed luxury real estate broker. I will have every single one of your badges for this illegal intrusion. Director Vance stepped out from the formation of agents at the base of the stairs. He looked up at her, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding authority. He held a thick manila envelope sealed with federal stamps. You were a licensed broker, Mrs. Sterling, Director Vance corrected her, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. As of 8 o'clock this morning, your downtown office was raided. Your servers have been seized. The State Commission has permanently revoked your real estate license due to overwhelming evidence of commercial fraud and federal tax evasion. Nia gripped the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The arrogant facade cracked instantly, exposing the terrified criminal underneath. My office. You have absolutely no proof of any wrongdoing. My business is completely separate from my husband. We have the escrow ledgers, Mrs. Sterling, Vance stated, slowly walking up the first few steps. We have the property deeds to the inflated commercial lots. We know exactly how you laundered $3 million of stolen corporate capital to fund the house you are standing in. Your husband has already been arrested for wire fraud, and you are officially the primary target of a massive federal money laundering investigation. Agents pushed past Nia, flooding into the master suite. She spun around, watching in pure horror as an agent immediately seized the open Louis Vuitton trunk on her bed. Stop! Nia shrieked, lunging toward the bedroom door. Those are my personal belongings. You cannot touch them. Another agent stepped directly into her path, blocking her entry. Every asset in this house is currently subject to federal civil forfeiture, the agent informed her coldly. Your jewelry, your designer bags, and your luxury vehicles were purchased with laundered, unreported funds. They are now the property of the United States government. Nia watched as an agent carefully bagged the Himalayan Birkin she had weaponized just days before. Another agent was rolling up her expensive Persian rugs. Outside the window, she could hear the rumble of flatbed tow trucks backing into the circular driveway to repossess her fleet of luxury sports cars. She had spent her entire adult life clawing her way to the top of the social ladder, manipulating everyone around her, and stepping on anyone who got in her way. She had looked down on Cassidy, believing her wealth made her untouchable. Now, stripped of her license, her bank accounts frozen, and her stolen treasures being packed away in federal evidence boxes, Nia was left with absolutely nothing. The lavish, untouchable lifestyle she had funded through theft and deceit had been completely dismantled in less than 5 minutes. The trap had snapped shut perfectly, crushing her right alongside the husband she had planned to abandon. While federal agents were busy packing Naya's stolen luxury goods into cardboard evidence boxes, a different kind of execution was taking place across the city. Richard and Beatrice had fled Vanguard Logistics headquarters in a state of catatonic shock. They retreated to the only place they believed was still safe, their sprawling 10-bedroom estate in the elite suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut. They barricaded themselves behind their wrought iron gates, desperately believing their wealth and social connections could somehow insulate them from the nuclear blast that had just detonated in their boardroom. Through Gideon's daily legal briefings and Dominic's network monitoring, I watched as their entire kingdom burned to ash. Richard sat in his mahogany-paneled study, frantically dialing every contact in his gold-plated address book. He called the hedge fund managers he golfed with. He called the local politicians he had funded. He called the private wealth bankers, who had kissed his ring for decades, begging for a bridge loan or a legal favor to stall the hostile takeover. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The few who did answer hung up the second they recognized his voice. The news of Preston's dramatic arrest and the brutal corporate seizure by Apex Recovery Holdings had already saturated the financial networks. In the ruthless ecosystem of the elite, Richard was no longer a kingmaker. He was radioactive. Beatrice paced back and forth across the Persian rugs of their grand living room, clutching a crystal tumbler of gin, her hands shaking violently. She was waiting for their crisis management team to arrive, expecting them to spin the narrative and salvage their reputation like they always did. Instead, the only person who showed up was their personal real estate attorney, a tired-looking man carrying a briefcase that seemed entirely too light. The attorney did not accept the drink Beatrice offered. He stood in the foyer and delivered the fatal blow. He informed them that Vanguard Logistics was officially gone. My blind trust had legally foreclosed on every corporate asset to cover the defaulted loans. But the nightmare was just beginning. Preston had not just ruined the company. His reckless borrowing and fraudulent collateralization had pierced the corporate veil. Because Richard was the primary shareholder and had personally guaranteed earlier operating loans that Preston subsequently defaulted on, Richard was legally on the hook for the remaining corporate shortfall. The debt was astronomical. Beatrice laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She told the attorney they would simply sell some stock. Perhaps they would liquidate the summer house in the Hamptons to cover the difference. The attorney slowly shook his head. He explained that federal authorities had already frozen the Hamptons property as part of the embezzlement investigation. The remaining debt far exceeded their liquid cash. The only legal maneuver left to avoid federal prosecution for the outstanding corporate liabilities was to file for immediate personal Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The word bankruptcy hung in the air like a death sentence. Beatrice dropped her glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, just like my champagne flute had shattered at the gala only days before. She screamed that they were a legacy family and that bankruptcy was for commoners. The attorney coldly informed her that the bank had already initiated foreclosure proceedings on the primary estate. The luxury cars were leased through the company, which meant my creditors were already en route to tow them away. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. Those 30 days evaporated in a haze of agonizing, inescapable humiliation. The fall from grace was absolute and entirely public. Moving trucks arrived at the grand estate, but they were not hired by my parents. They were auction liquidators. Men in heavy work boots marched through the pristine halls, tagging antique furniture, grand pianos, and Beatrice's beloved art collection with bright yellow auction stickers. Every symbol of their superiority was catalogued and sold to the highest bidder to satisfy the debts they owed me. 2 flatbed tow trucks backed into the circular driveway. Richard stood on the front porch, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, watching as his prized Mercedes-Benz and Beatrice's luxury SUV were chained up and hauled away. They were left with a decade-old sedan they had to purchase in cash, just to have basic transportation to the courthouse. Desperate to maintain some shred of her former identity, Beatrice attempted one last, pathetic bid to cling to her social status. She drove the beat-up sedan to the security gate of her prestigious country club, intending to attend her weekly charity luncheon. She expected the usual warm greeting from the staff. Instead, the security guard stepped out of his booth, holding a clipboard. He informed her that her membership had been suspended pending a board review, citing the morality clause in her contract. The wealthy ladies she had gossiped with, the women she had bragged to about her perfect family, had unanimously voted to expel her. Beatrice sat in her cheap car and watched through the iron gates as her former friends sipped mimosas on the patio, completely ignoring her existence. She was erased from their world just as easily as she had erased me from hers. With their assets liquidated and their social status pulverized, Richard and Beatrice were forced to move into a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a noisy, working-class neighborhood. The walls were paper-thin. The view was a brick alleyway overlooking a dumpster. There were no charity galas, no catered dinners, no powerful friends to call. They were completely isolated, trapped in a prison of their own making. They had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable commodities, judging the world entirely on bank balances and zip codes. They had thrown their own daughter out on the street because she did not fit their flawless aesthetic. Now, stripped of their money and their name, they were forced to look in the mirror. They were left with nothing but the crushing realization that their golden boy was sitting in a federal penitentiary facing a decade behind bars. Their daughter-in-law was completely ruined, and the daughter they had discarded was the billionaire who owned the very ground they used to walk on. The house of cards had completely collapsed, burying them beneath the rubble. The transition from the wreckage of their lives to the pristine pavement outside my corporate headquarters took exactly 3 weeks. I stepped out of the climate-controlled lobby of Aegis Data Defense into the biting cold of a late November afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and a sharp wind whipped through the downtown financial district. My security detail stood by the open doors of my waiting armored sedan, ready to escort me to a celebratory dinner with my board of directors. Before I could step across the pavement, a commotion near the outer security perimeter caught my attention. 2 figures were arguing with my armed guards, their voices cracking with a desperate, shivering urgency. I paused, recognizing the silhouettes long before I recognized their clothes. It was Richard and Beatrice. The transformation was so absolute it was almost hard to comprehend. The arrogant patriarch who had commanded ballrooms in bespoke navy suits was now swimming in a cheap, ill-fitting gray overcoat that looked like it had been bought off a discount rack. His shoulders were permanently hunched, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of federal investigations and absolute bankruptcy. Beatrice, the woman who had mocked me draped in cashmere and pearls, was shivering in the wind, wearing a faded rain jacket. Her perfectly dyed hair showed inches of gray roots. The haughty, aristocratic makeup was gone, revealing a face deeply lined with genuine, inescapable terror. My head of security looked back at me and reached for his radio to call the police. I raised a single hand, signaling him to stand down. I buttoned my tailored wool coat and walked slowly toward the barricade. I did not feel the familiar surge of anxiety or the suffocating need for approval that had defined my youth. I felt absolutely nothing. They were just 2 desperate strangers on the sidewalk. When Beatrice saw me approaching, she broke away from the guard. She fell to her knees right there on the freezing concrete. The proud, untouchable matriarch of the Sterling Empire was kneeling in the dirt, openly weeping in front of dozens of corporate executives and busy pedestrians walking by. "Cassidy!" Beatrice sobbed, her voice a raw, hoarse sound that scraped against the wind. "Please, please, look at us. We lost everything. We have absolutely nothing left." Richard stood behind her, his hands shaking violently. He did not puff out his chest. He did not issue commands. He looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes, and for the first time in his life, he did not try to hide his tears. "We are so sorry," Richard croaked, pulling off his cheap wool hat, exposing his thinning hair to the cold air. "We were blind, Cassidy. We were so obsessed with the company and the legacy that we sacrificed our own daughter. Preston is facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Nia took whatever cash she had hidden and ran. We live in a filthy, freezing apartment. We are completely broken. Please, we are begging you. You proved your point. You won. Let us back into your life. We just want our daughter back." I stood a few feet away from them, watching the spectacle. A crowd of pedestrians had started to form a wide circle around us, watching the scene with morbid curiosity. In the past, the threat of a public scene would have sent my parents into a spiral of aggressive damage control. Now, they did not even care who was watching. Hunger, humiliation, and isolation had completely stripped away their pride. Beatrice reached a hand out, her trembling fingers hovering inches from the hem of my coat, too afraid to actually touch me. "We were wrong about you," she cried, her tears splashing onto the concrete. "You were always the smart one. You were always the strong one. We see it now. Please, Cassidy, we will do anything. We will live by your rules. Just do not let us die in that terrible place. We are your family." I looked down at the weeping woman on the ground. I looked at the broken man standing behind her. I searched my heart for a flicker of sympathy, a single shred of familial loyalty. I found only a vast, peaceful emptiness. "You do not miss your daughter," I said, my voice steady, calm, and carrying with absolute clarity. "You miss your comfort. You miss your social status. You miss the warmth of your mansion and the status of your last name. You are not crying because you realized you treated me terribly. You are crying because you finally have to live in the reality you created." Richard took a tentative step forward, his hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "Cassidy, that is not true. We love you. We have always loved you. We just did not know how to show it. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. The fury that had powered my hostile takeover was entirely spent. You knew exactly how to show it, Richard," I replied, looking directly into his hollow eyes. "You knew how to show it to Preston. You knew how to protect him, fund him, and cover up his crimes, because he fit your aesthetic. You threw me away when I was struggling because I was not a good accessory for your image. You told me my depression was a weakness. You told me my exhaustion was a failure. You threw me out into the cold because you thought I would never amount to anything." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, increasing the physical distance between my world and theirs. "You spent your entire lives building a legacy of manipulation, greed, and superficial perfection," I continued, my words dropping like heavy stones. "You raised a son who became a felon. You protected a daughter-in-law who became a fraud. You traded your integrity for country club memberships and corporate pride. Now, you have exactly the legacy you built." Beatrice let out a pitiful sob, burying her face in her hands. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, fresh tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. They had no counter-arguments. They had no defense. They were completely and utterly defeated by the unvarnished truth. My head of security stepped forward and opened the rear door of my waiting armored sedan. Warm, leather-scented air spilled out into the freezing street, a stark contrast to the bitter cold where my parents remained. I looked at them one last time. There was no grand, cinematic farewell. There was no lingering hesitation. "Goodbye, Richard. Goodbye, Beatrice," I said softly. I turned my back to them and climbed into the back of the car. The heavy, bulletproof door slammed shut behind me with a solid, definitive thud, cutting off the sound of my mother's crying completely. I settled into the plush leather seat and looked straight ahead. The driver pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the flowing city traffic. I did not look out the window. I did not check the rearview mirror. I left them kneeling on the freezing pavement, entirely consumed by the ruins of their own making, as I drove away forever. The takeover of Vanguard Logistics was swift and entirely ruthless for those at the top. The morning after I left my parents kneeling on the freezing pavement, I walked into corporate headquarters not as a visitor, and certainly not as an estranged daughter. I walked in as the absolute owner. I did not waste time with lengthy transition periods or graceful exits. I fired every single board member who had sat in that room, ready to liquidate my shares based on a fabricated narrative. I gutted the executive suite completely, terminating the toxic management team that had blindly facilitated my brother's offshore embezzlement. Vice presidents who had signed off on the phantom maintenance logs tried to offer me deals in exchange for their severance packages. I had my security team escort them straight out the front doors with nothing but cardboard boxes holding their desk plants. But I did not burn the entire empire to the ground. I walked out of the glass-walled executive offices and took the heavy freight elevator down to the massive shipping hubs. I stood on the cold concrete floors among the hundreds of truckers, mechanics, and dispatchers who had kept the company alive while my family bled it dry. I looked at the exhausted, hard-working men and women who had been terrified of losing their livelihoods right before the holidays. I assured them their pensions were fully secured. I implemented immediate wage increases utilizing the capital we legally recovered from my sister-in-law's frozen real estate assets. I stripped the corporation of the vanity and the corruption, returning dignity and profits to the people actually doing the work. Vanguard Logistics survived, but the arrogant, toxic legacy was permanently excised from its foundation. Now, a year later, the crisp autumn wind howled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, but inside, the atmosphere radiated an absolute, undeniable warmth. It was Thanksgiving Day. The scent of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and spiced mulled wine filled the vast living space. But there were no forced pleasantries here, no underlying tensions, no silent judgments, and no performative affection. I stood at my open kitchen island, pouring a glass of vintage red wine, simply watching the people who filled my home. Dominic was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa, passionately debating predictive data models for the upcoming football season with my lead software engineers. Gideon, my ruthless Wall Street litigator, had loosened his silk tie and was currently engaged in a booming, joyous debate about state fiscal policy with Governor Mitchell, who had insisted on dropping by for a drink before his own family obligations. Dominic raised his glass of bourbon, catching my eye from across the Marble Island. He gave me a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal war we had won together. They were not my blood relatives. We did not share DNA or a complicated, traumatic childhood history. But as I watched them laugh, argue, and share a meal in my home, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of belonging. They were the people who had stood by me in the trenches. They were the ones who respected my mind, protected my blind spots, and helped me build an empire from nothing. They were my true family. I tapped my silver spoon against my crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear chime instantly quieted the lively conversations echoing across the room. Every face turned toward me, their expressions reflecting genuine affection and unwavering respect. I raised my glass, looking at each of them in turn. "We are told from the moment we are born that blood is the ultimate bond," I began, my voice steady and ringing with absolute conviction. "We are told that family is a permanent, unconditional contract, and that we must endlessly forgive those who share a last name, even when they tear us down, even when they leave us out in the cold. But that is a lie. Blood does not make a family. Respect makes a family. Loyalty makes a family. Standing up for someone when they have absolutely nothing to offer you in return, that is what makes a family." I took a slow breath, feeling the heavy ghosts of my past detach completely and dissolve into the ether. For 20 years, I was told I was the weak link. I was cast out because I did not fit into a perfect, superficial portrait. I was thrown to the wolves with the expectation that I would quietly disappear. They wanted me to be the scapegoat, the failure who carried the weight of their own deep insecurities. But they severely underestimated what happens when you throw a capable woman into the fire. I smiled, a fierce, unyielding truth settling deep into my bones. I did not just survive the flames. The fire they threw me into forged my armor. They expected me to remain the helpless victim crying in the ashes, but instead, I became the dragon they could never slay. "To the family we choose," I toasted, raising my glass higher, "and to the empires we build from the ashes." The room erupted into cheers, glasses clinking together in a joyous, ringing harmony. I took a sip of my wine, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of peace settle over my entire life. If you are listening to this and you have ever been made to feel like you do not belong in your own family, hear this right now. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. You do not have to accept abuse disguised as obligation. Your worth is not determined by people who lack the capacity or the intelligence to see it. Walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Build your own table. Build your own empire. And never, ever apologize for taking your power back. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found strength in this journey, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own unbreakable power. Stay fierce, and never let anyone tell you that you do not belong. The deepest lesson here is that blood does not equal family. Respect does. These protagonists spent years seeking validation from relatives who treated them as convenient scapegoats. True empowerment only began when they stopped waiting for empty apologies and started building their own tables. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is an act of profound self-love. When toxic environments refuse to make room for your true worth, your greatest victory is walking away to create your own. Take a moment today to evaluate your boundaries and share one way you protect your peace in the comments below.